All right. Hello and welcome back to the Game Dev Show. I'm here with Powell, Greg, Andrew, who's not dead, and Yorai. Andrew is alive. His internet just seemed to have died or caught a virus for the last couple weeks. So welcome back, Andrew. And Yorai.
Yeah. Andrew caught the holiday season. I caught the Unreal Engine backend season. It's a very serious case of trying to dig for souls.
So how's everybody doing today? And how's everybody in chat? Good?
Good. Yeah.
Good.
Powell's the only one with real snow here, right? Or Greg, do you have some actual snow at your house?
No, it's like 40 to 50 degrees here. Fahrenheit.
Yeah, that sounds very cool.
40 to 50 would be hellish.
I think I have.
They are predicting snow, I think, this weekend in the I-95 corridor, like Maryland, DC, Pennsylvania. But I think we're just outside the range for it.
Snow sounds cold.
Yeah, I have -1 Celsius, so it's about how many Fahrenheit? 30 Fahrenheit.
That's the temperature my ice cream is at. So that's it's very cool.
Yeah. Winter is my least favorite month, and where I am, it just now turned winter for us, which probably colder than you're used to, Jason, but warmer than everybody else is used to. But it's getting down to freezing at night from time to time, and that's just ridiculous cold. I don't like it.
No.
Give me summer.
I think on Monday it should be -10 Celsius in Poland. Yes. So
wow. I hope you enjoy your indoors.
No, I don't care. That's normal in winter here.
I feel like those temperatures should only exist in video games. Like Iceland should be video game worlds only.
One of the coworkers at Relogic sent a picture of waking up to a snowy day. The Porsche had like a fence, and the fence had like this much snow on top of it, just a single line.
Yeah,
I think that I live an hour away from snow, so I can go to snow anytime I want. I just don't want to, but I can if I really, really want to do, and then I can come back and not be in snow.
And you can see it from far away, right? You can just look around and see the top of the mountain. Like, look, I see snow.
If I was not in suburbia, covered by the horizon, covered by houses, then yes, I would see snow in the mountains. And
got to climb up on the roof and go look at the snow.
Yeah, I think I saw some yesterday on a walk. I was like, is that snow or are those clouds? I couldn't really tell. It was far away. But soon enough, there will be a lot of snow, and then I could go there for an hour or two and come back. That's great. It can take an hour or two.
Yeah, I agree. I like the snow and cold at a distance. Make it optional. Keep it warm otherwise.
Yeah.
So there's I guess first off, Happy New Year's to everybody. It's a brand new year, and I assume everybody's got some stuff in mind that they've got planned. If anybody in chat has some interesting New Year's resolutions, we're curious to see what they are too. Drop them in there. But before we get into all the interesting topics, anybody have any big plans or new things going on this year or that they're excited about and want to share, or not excited about and willing to share?
Terraria hasn't released an update in 2023, at least nothing substantial. And the update from then is still being worked on, so there is that. We're just about to get back into work, so exciting times. Yeah.
Okay. More last updates, I expect.
More last. It's the final update. Get it together.
More final updates.
Final.
Fantasy.
Anybody else?
File names. Final.
Oh, God. You've worked with artists before, huh?
Well, I have, yes. And I have got many final versions.
Final 2, Final 3, Final for real 2.
The first one now, I'm like, oh yeah, right. That's good thinking. They're trying to manifest the end of this project. I see what you're doing.
Yeah.
But no, I'm excited to continue working on my projectile system that I was working on. And I got the slow internet just frustrated the heck out of me. I couldn't do anything. Loading a web page took 5 seconds longer than any web page should, just because my upload speed was so shit, basically, and that was a bottleneck. And so I got frustrated, so I couldn't do anything. I could have kept working on my system, but instead
code without internet. It's not possible.
I know, especially in the AI world now, right? So instead, I got addicted to Civilization 6 again, which I should not have done.
Oh. I saw that. And you're using mods?
Yes, I use mods. So, and years ago, Civ 5, I got bored of it, which, after 1,000 hours, that one might do that. I'm up to 1,500 hours on that now. I haven't played in many years, but that's where I ended. That was Civ 5. But then I discovered the mods for the first time, and I was like, oh, this changes everything. What does this do it? And then I discovered all these new things. So Civ, but it's the one game. I've talked before about most games I don't really like. I don't like most games. But Civ is the one game ever since Civ 1 when I was like 13 or whatever, I get addicted to it. And I've used it to my advantage when I'm trying to lose weight or not, because I can focus on not eating food because I'm so to it. And so that's been helpful. But there have been multiple times in the past where I've had to delete it from my computer in order to stop playing it. And I actually did delete it earlier, but then my internet stopped and I was like, Jesus. So I was able to download it. The download speeds were fine. So I was able to download it again. So
yeah,
my goal is to do a stream on Sunday and kick myself out of it by streaming on Sunday now that I can.
Civilization is one of those addicting games that the reason that I find myself getting addicted to is that every turn something new can happen because there's such a massive pool of content into it. And when you do finally, after hours upon hours, manage to reach a point where you can predict most of that content, you can literally just look at the Steam Workshop and the entire experience begins afresh.
Yep. I think about this while I'm playing it because we all know it's the one more turn phenomenon, and it's essentially, and this actually somebody once said somewhere, Civilization is basically you're just filling up a bunch of buckets. That's all you're doing. You're filling a bunch of buckets up with marbles, and then they empty, and you get something. And it just like second grade, when you're a good kid, you get a bucket of the marble, you get a pizza party at the end or something. And maybe they didn't have that in other and so but they have so many overlapping things. It's absolutely true that every turn you get some small reward, or you're that close to some small reward or some achievement, some thing that you were working towards. I want to see what happens if I do this. I want to see what happens. And then the mods, holy shit. Once you get done with everything and all the things that trigger your dopamine get done, you can download a new mod and have a new bucket to fill.
You reminded me that I used to make mods for my friends in Civilization 5. I actually went and done the whole making the word escapes me now, an icon for the countries for each person, and we made unique units and mechanics, and we looked up art to put on the characters. That's before the age of AI, so I basically did it all with very, very careful usage of Photoshop to make sure that it's high quality. Then we would play one session of it, something would break terribly in a funny way. We'd all have our fun for another 2 hours, and then we'd stop and we'll go hibernate and not play for another month.
Sounds about right. I'm curious real quick, did all of you do similar stuff? Because that sounds like a lot. I did very similar things to what Yorai is describing there with the mods. Did you all mod games before you started working on them and changing them? No, Greg?
Well, the only game I modded, I did level creation for Wolfenstein 3D. I had a level editor and I would create my own levels and give them to my friends to play, but I didn't actually
mod it. You just didn't count it.
I did not, but in a way, the original Excite Bike, my favorite thing to do on that game was to create my own levels. You couldn't save them, but I would create them and then play them. That was in the 80s.
That was the 2D racing jumping one, right? For everybody who hasn't seen it, you could build the little tracks and the jumps and then play them and see if you can
no turns.
Yeah. I think for me the first one was Sokoban. Yeah, the old Japan game where you just could build levels on your own. Yeah, but mods, I think the first mods I wrote were for Command and Conquer series, the first one. So because you can change everything there if you knew how to do it.
Oh,
Yeah, it's fun when games become modular to the point where you can literally swap out most of the game's systems and units and just like an entirely different game, but somebody programmed the entire engine for you to consume.
Mm.
yeah. You would never support something like that, Yuri.
What? Couldn't hear you. I was busy looking at
Exact
the a gigantic amount of users on Tmod Loader right now. It's really interesting. It's like it's spiking up on the holidays, but more than that, the ratio is like way beyond what I ever expected. Luckily, because Tmod Loader has its own like counter on Steam charts, you can actually see the ratio of people on Terraria versus Tmod
Can you
Loader.
tell everybody what that is for the people who
Yeah.
haven't played or maybe new to it? Just real quick. And before you do, can everybody hit the like button for this explanation?
Yeah, so I'll start by explaining what Terraria is, just because not everybody here may have gotten to it. Terraria is a game on Steam. I am the lead developer currently for the past few years. And I started by being a modder in Terraria and having a mod on the forums. And that was at a point at 2012 when the CEO said, I'm passing the torch, I'm done working on the game. It was the final update. And so I started modding with a friend. And we ended up in a situation where we wanted to have our two mods running together, but we would both be replacing the game's executable file. Now, because we are working on our changes separately, and there is only one executable file, we couldn't have the mods together. Eventually, we came up with a solution where people can have a mod loader that loads other files, and then you can get all the mods running together. But in order to have that happen, the executable file needed to have hooks into every point in the code that somebody wants to make an edit for. And it ended up with a small team. It was back in the HexChat days, IRC. And it was a gigantic thread on the main forums. And there was even a competition where we made like a Christmas mod. And eventually the developer came back and I managed to get into the company. I'm very grateful for that. And since then, I've been working on the game, eventually getting to contribute to some major things that I really, really loved. And now we're at an age where I no longer work on the modding section of the game. And the solution has been replaced twice now. We had tconfig, with some amazing people. Then TAPI, once Terraria had a major update and tconfig no longer worked, and redoing the entire work gave us an opportunity to redo how the mod loading worked for it. And then when I left that again, a new team of modders came in and they made Tmod Loader. And Tmod Loader is amazing. Just straight up, it's great. It's got a great community. A lot of people there are contributing, and I'm very grateful for them. They made a modding API way better than what I could have ever imagined. And we really wanted to support that, especially me from the internal end, that I was a modder originally. I started adjusting the code of the game's primary executable to be easier to work with mods. And we started directly communicating with the modding community to make sure that like whatever we have doesn't royally screw how the modding works, and like making things as easy for them as possible within the means of what we can do. And right now we are at a very happy age where we actually managed to get Valve to approve having Tmod Loader as an official mod on for Terraria on Steam. So now everybody that has Terraria can literally officially find that, and it's getting supported by Relogic. The development, we basically are paying for some of the most major contributors to keep working on it, and trying to make sure that it's the best it can be. And one of them is even helping on the Terraria side the official executable side. It's really incredible, and I'm very thankful for them. So yeah, Team Mod Loader is a mod loader for Terraria in which you can try to have almost any type of content changed.
What are
there
like
are-
the extremes of the types of mods that you've seen done or done yourself? Probably you've seen some crazy stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty. Some mods go as far as to change the main menu of the game because they are so massive. They have like their own title. They introduce entire new system where you have seasonal content, so the forests become tainted by the version of the season. You can have spreading fires. Trees actually fall off instead of popping like they do in Minecraft and in Terraria. There are so many big things that, like, internally, the entire implementation has changed. There's also post-processing that makes the game look way more advanced than it is, like adding bloom to the game when it does not have any level of HDR or a source of sun. Yeah, there's just so much. As for mods that really mess with the system, throughout the years, I've worked on multiple iterations of a dual wielding mod, which is something very difficult to do because the player code was designed to only ever be using one item at a time. So the code basically revolves around wrapping every single major function of the player, swapping the internals of what the player state holds, letting the second weapon run, swapping back to the first version of the weapon, and letting the game continue as if the second weapon never existed. But every time code that relates to that second weapon, such as a shot fired 3 seconds ago that's still in the air, it swaps back to being on the second weapon just to make sure that nothing can go wrong on that part. And it's also injecting itself with between packets that are sent for multiplayer. So every time that one of those second weapon contents have to be validated, the game sends, hey, actually start thinking about the second weapon. Hey, start thinking about the first weapon. So that is a thing. Another mod is adding local multiplayer or multiplayer, where every player can have multiple characters on the screen with their own viewport, and their own inputs being sent to each other, and you can swap between which player you're playing and letting AI control the characters that you're not controlling. That is a whole bag of beans that I'm not willing to open right now because I never got it to work to the level that I am happy with. But the same concept lets you do so much more. You can do time dilation, making the game run slower or faster, because you can start swapping the sets of updates. So you can let the world have a dummy update where it's basically empty, and then bring back the entire world for the sake of rendering. So basically the world has never updated, but now you have time running slower. Or you can do this faster, where you can actually ask it to update twice, and then you don't need to do any of the rendering stuff. But it lets you have such tight control, like adding hit stop to the game. Or doing dimensions, because Terraria does not have dimensions, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Primarily memory. The world is gigantic, and we don't do you only load the chunks that you have. The entire world is loaded at the same time. Ergo, on a game that's still running on 32-bit systems, we have a memory limit, and we will hit that limit if we try to run 2 worlds at the same time without any major changes. So you can still do that, because in Team Loader, the executable is actually for 64 bits. So if you have more memory, have at it. So you can literally have 2 worlds loaded at the same time, and then swap which world you're in, and the renderer and everything works magically for that.
That's yeah. There's a lot of questions in chat here for you too. Andrew looks like he's got something ready to ask.
Well, I certainly the question that the bull asked in chat is of interest to me. I was also going to ask you, Ryan, all these different things that people are doing. How much of, like, what percentage of them, if even that's the way to ask it, were intentional by the team? Now we did this so that people can do these mods. Like, we did this so that people can add audio. And how much were just people hacking away, figuring out that they could do something that was not at all intended by the team?
So for that, we need to get into how adding mod support actually works, because there are there are two very different schools of thought for this.
Well,
The
that
first one
segues to the Bulls question then.
to the what?
The Bulls has the question, how do you add mods, essentially?
Yeah, okay. So what are simple things you can do to make your game more accessible to modders is a great question for this. I will be covering that as well. I want to get into the two separate schools of thought for modding, just so everybody is on the same page on why we do the things the way we do them. The first way is making the game actually accept external files such that it shows them within the game. I am saying that as though it's some grand concept, but this is basically save files. It's the exact same thing. There is a record that is not part of the game executable files somewhere on the PC. The game accepts it, the game loads it, presents it to the player, and acts as though it is something tangible, as though you can enter that save and continue playing with it. Now, this might sound like it's not modding at all, but if you have a piece of text in the game, say an NPC named, I don't know, big little JSON, and that is supposed to be a fixed record that never changes, but you accept an external file that says, actually, change that to Andrew. You have modded the game. So this is the first thing. If you accept an external file and that external file is shown within the game, this is modding. Even if you call it saving, it's modding. The second school of thought is making the game compatible with an infinite amount of content such that you don't hard code things and you don't hard code expectations for certain pieces of content, and you can load as many as you need dynamically. This is not official mod support, but it makes things for modders way easier, because if they can plug into the game's code, officially or unofficially, they can start doing whatever they want within it. For example, unloading content that exists. If I had hard-coded JSON to be in the game, even if the name is swappable, JSON has to be in the game. If I said there are actors and JSON is an actor within the game, I can unload all actors and then I don't have a JSON in the game. So
real quick, do you do that with like an API that you're exposing to just unload all actors or a specific actor, or you do it through files, or is there like a preferred way to go about doing that?
The preferred way is the one that's easiest for you to work with and the easiest for other people to offer. The worst thing you can do from the design of allowing modding for your game is making content that nobody else but you can create, which means content that's made in your own custom system that you don't publish, or content that is so complex that nobody understands what it means. This is one of the things that games do to prevent cheating, where they start changing names of things so that you don't know how to work with them. You don't know what the variables A, B, C, X, Y, Z do. But if they were name, level, current health, current mana, strength, you would know what to do with them. So making things human readable for strangers outside of your domain of control and help makes modding way easier. Yeah. Now, yeah. So what are simple things you can do to make your game more accessible to modders? The first actual answer here is to literally accept external files, and then make sure those files are easy to create. If they're a simple text file, hella easy. If they're a simple image, hella easy. Unity and Unreal both have code that you can call to load in external files that is extremely easy to use, and you don't even need to use a specific game engine for that. File.read all text works. And to get on that point, the entire idea of Steam Workshop being an ephemeral thing that a lot of people are afraid to use, it's literally just a file distributor. The entire thing is literally just a file distributor. You tell it what files are uploaded and called a mod pack. It has a page on the Steam Workshop site. People say, I subscribe to this mod, which literally only says, download this file before the user enters the game. This is all. And it can be any type of file. It can be a single files. It can be folders. It can be folders of images, text. It can be folders of mesh files. It can be worlds in your game that are on your own custom format. It can be anything. It doesn't matter. And then it's just
So they want to play a mod, they just hit the button in Steam with the workshop, and then it's going to download the files and play, and then you just load up that mod essentially, right?
Yeah. It's literally Steam guarantees, or tries to guarantee, that as you enter the game, all the mod files will be ready for you to consume. There is the Steam API, which is a pack of code that says, here are some things the Valve developers have created for you. Use them to make your own life easier. One of those is the workshop support, which literally only says, check if the user is logged into Steam, check what mods they are subscribed to. For those mods, give the folder paths of the mods. And then from there, you're on your own. You literally just load in the files. When you ask Steam to give you workshop files, it's literally just looking at the folder of the workshop current content and gives you what is in there from the content to which you are subscribed. For Sinister Mephisto saying that easy modding is easy hacking, that's correct. Accepting external files means, yes, you are letting anything load on your application. Yes, if it's an infinite file and your computer can't read it, the game will crash, or your entire computer, depending. If your game executes anything based on the reading of the file, yeah, they can run malicious code on your game. There are a lot of caveats to modding. You have to add fail-safes if you care about it. There are games that will not do anything beyond the basics, and users just have to accept it with a grain of salt. It's best if you warn users about this, to not load anything that they don't trust. For trusting, that's on the user's own ability to judge. Public portals to upload files tend to have some level of validation on what is being uploaded in there, but they will not always catch it, especially if you start looking into compressed files or passworded files. This is beyond other people's control. Try to stick to official channels when you can. Try to keep the modding as simple and common file pattern as you can. Do not use vulnerable means of loading content. If you can.
What would be vulnerable versus not vulnerable for?
So when you have a file reader, the file reader has many things that it is responsible for doing. The first one is giving you all the bytes. And that is the first point of failure. How does it know how many bytes there are? Usually, the Windows API can give you like read all bytes. And these are the bytes. They are guaranteed to be just the bytes. If you don't do anything special with them, there is no problem. The problem becomes when you start reading content that is of a variable size within those bytes. So for example, I want to read a string and I'm using binary. The string at the start will say, I am this many characters long. But it doesn't actually have to guarantee that there are other bytes beyond the amount it says. So it can say, I am 1,000 characters long, but it will only have 10, or it will actually have 10,000. And now the 9,000 after the 1,000 is guaranteed can be malicious code. And if you do anything to read those, we're done here. They can start like loading things that they didn't say that they have, or they can start loading, or they can let leaks occur such that they expose some vulnerable part of your game. There are a lot of like small things. I'm not an expert on the topic. I just know that basics enough to be dangerous when I'm working on this, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah, there was a conversation earlier about the Unity's UGC stuff too. I thought Taro was talking to some people in chat. Have anybody here used that system before, the Unity UGC? Is it similar to Steam's Workshop?
I have not used it. From my understanding, they are trying to be rather identical to it and provide better moderation alongside it, letting every user of the service have their own mods workshop where people can vet, upload, and moderate the content there. For example, promoting certain content for the season or etc., and letting users download it. And I don't remember, but I think there was something about making it compatible with more platforms than just Steam's PC support. So,
Nice. Yeah, I've been meaning to dig into it. I want to check it out a little bit and see if maybe add a little module to the multiplayer course going into it. I assume it's going to be pretty straightforward and kind of an interesting one to get people into. I know, Andrew, you got to go pretty soon, so I just wanted to quickly see like what's going on over there. What's new before you go? Or are you going to put some modding stuff into your game? Are you is this like a path that you're going to try to follow?
Yeah, well, I think it's since I like it, as the few games I do play, I love it. So it is. I for Legend of the Stones, I want to have the ability for people to add, at the very least, new weapons and new, bad guys or something like that. I think enemies, bad guys, with all the logic therein, is more complicated than a sword that just gets equipped. But at the very least, having new items and changing the values of things. But that makes me think, okay, well, I'm using the game modules for package that I put on the asset store for Legend of the Stones. And that means that anything I enable for modding has to be enabled with that. So now the real question is, how can I enable game modules for in such a way that allows for mods so that,
Yeah, so there is a very clean solution here, which is basically having an intermediate file. You are writing things with your stat modules, but that doesn't mean that the game has to load them from within your system. It can create objects by just loading them from externally, which means, yes, you can save it and then load it from another place, and then people would need your package to mod your game, which is not ideal. They're buying the game, not a package on the asset store.
Yeah.
But you don't have to use that format. You can say, I have a text file. This is a sword. This is its name. This is its description. This is the level required. This is the stats that it adds, all in text or in XML or in JSON or YAML or whatever format that you want. And then when the game loads, you say, read that file, convert it into a local structure that matches how you would create your weapon, and then load that weapon into the weapon database. As for making the weapon available, that's a whole another topic that you do need to address there as well.
What about the model part too? Anybody talk a little bit about that? So they want to add a new weapon, but if it's all text, you want a new visual for it, so somebody can sell that sword for $1,000 on Steam. That beautiful skin. It still blows my mind when my son tells me, it's like, oh yeah, I have this $400 gun skin. I'm like, hey, luckily I convinced him to sell most of the ones that were like ridiculously overvalued, but it just blows me away that people pay crazy amounts of money for skins on weapons. Sorry, go ahead.
No, all good. So let's get into what is actually a weapon model. It's the 3D points that create the weapon. It's the face order of those points. Like these 3 points create a face. And then there is a material that says I'm using this texture for albedo, this texture for normals, this texture for metallics, and I am actually tinted to that color. All of this information can still be presented as text as simple image files or simple model files. As for loading that, there are plenty of different software packages for it. I think there's like 10 on the asset store and some official ones that you can use and some public packages that if you don't want to use any of that. But it's really just that. You don't need to complicate it too much. As for making it, you want to use a file format that's easiest for people to do. CodeMonkey made a video about modding his game to add batteries that players can cook and eat. This was literally done by creating simple OBJ files, object files. It's just mesh data without any type of rigging or the complex stuff that comes with having swords. And he just used that. And that plus texture, done.
Makes a lot of sense.
Put them all in your game. So speaking of mods, one of the things I wanted to talk to all of you about too was City Skylines 2 does not have mods yet. City Skylines 1 was like full of mods, but next week, I think it's Tuesday, I get to interview the CEO of the company that made not City Skylines 2. That would be nice. I'm gonna try to weasel that in soon. But the company that made the character setup for it, the populate setup that does all of the massive character generation and simulation of the well, I don't know exactly. I'm still trying to figure out exactly which parts it is. It seems like it's the character generation and animation and stuff. I'm still trying to learn and understand more, and I'm hoping that in this interview I can learn a lot more about it. But I was curious if you guys have seen that system or know of anything I should ask about in that interview, or if anybody in chat does. Andrew, you got anything? It's massive character generation. It's kind of like have you seen the system? If you go to populate, just L8, the number 8, it's a system for just building, massive characters for games. But I still don't, like I said, understand exactly how it works and what level of how you can use the characters. But they show it used in an MMO as the main characters, and then used in City Skylines where there's tens of thousands at least of them roaming around, at least in my cities.
So just to get into the entire topic of character creation a bit, I have not played City Skylines 2. I have seen the performance inspection mega thread as a result of the game's launch. For small characters, generally, you want to have very distinct looking silhouettes. Like one character is bigger, one character is smaller, one character is thinner, one character is wider, and contrasting colors. And I don't know how much you can zoom in on them in City Skylines.
In City Skylines, that's the crazy part, is like you're out far, you can see all the characters, but you can zoom in and see them like right up to their face, and they're all like individual characters. You can just click and follow a character around and watch them walking around the city with the other guys and doing that stuff. So
yeah, so they would need like the whole model data and potentially rigging down to finger level. I'm not entirely sure. Just for people wondering why I said that. Characters generally require a skeleton, and the skeleton has a limited amount of bones. The more bones you have, the more expensive it is to animate a character. A human body can be expressed with very few bones. Like if I have a shoulder reaching to my upper arm, then lower arm, and then the hand, that's like 3. But then you add the fingers and it's suddenly 18 because each finger has the distal, proximal, and intermediate. So fingers matter. As for the character creation details here, it's pretty difficult to assess what is unique about this so far, but it is looking like it's covering all the topic. I see they're talking about modifying things that you do have, having the automated asset fitting, which is a gigantic topic. Specifically, you have characters of different proportions. Say you made glasses for one character, and then you want the glasses to be on another character. You'd think this is a very simple thing, but the characters have different sections between the head, the width from ear to ear, and that is only one of the problems on glasses fitting. You actually have to make sure that they're front or backward enough to sit just on the nose. And what if the nose is differently angled? So can it actually sit properly? There's like an infinite amount of complexity in just that. So automated asset fitting tends to fail a lot. If they have a good solution for that, this is something that I would ask a lot about. This is like one of those most exciting topics that a lot of things are gotten wrong at every single solution I've ever seen. What the biggest programs like Does 3D and a few similar ones boast about having a gigantic library of clothes that you can like already use, because there is a lot to customize, but they all share like the same base skeleton, and they have their own like mega morphing rig that tries to fit it. Andrew would know because all his assets have a gigantic amount of like blend shape configurations. But this stuff tends to be memory expensive and not game ready, specifically when you have like a gigantic library of it. Because every single one of those megamorphs is basically the entire model again, but with the adjustments in the memory. So you have different versions of the models as offset to the original one, and then you sample them all and mix them together. It's not simple for the computer to deal with, especially because most of this is on the CPU.
So, add nature manufactures lava. I should link that in a second. Real quick, I just want to say hello, Jason Story. I'm gonna put you up here since you're looking that way. There you go.
Howdy.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know Andrew's gonna leave us in just a minute.
I'm going to pop off, but one question that I'll have to come back later to see if there's an answer for on modding, just to ask it, is what is the pros and cons of basically having Unity itself be the modding platform for the game so that, people can just go into Unity, create a prefab with some specifications. You can then provide scripts, I suppose, and other things.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, but I'll try to be quick.
Okay.
To have Unity as your modding platform, you need everybody to install Unity, which is a big step that a lot of people aren't very enthusiastic about. You want to make modding as frictionless as possible. This is a lot of friction. They have to install the Unity hub, then they have to install Unity, then they have to start understanding how to even use Unity in the first place. You're limiting your modder pool to literally only Unity developers or people who are really, really addicted to your game and need to figure out how to use Unity just to work with your game. Then there is the entire complexity of Unity's packages. Which render pipeline do you use? It changes the materials that you'll have to work with. Which version of Unity you use affects the serialization of the files that Unity saves for you to load. So you have to make sure that the Unity version matches. And if they downloaded the wrong version, they made a mod and the mod doesn't work because the version is different, you have no way to tell. And you need to start asking them all those questions. This is friction and very easy to mistake one. So,
and if you want to hear that from the horse's mouth, have a look at anybody who does VR chat characters and that kind of thing. They'll complain regularly that if anything on the actual app side changes, all the modders have to go through the whole same process of new updated versions and new stuff and all of that.
Yeah, and then on top of that, not just the material changes, but the scripts. If you change your scripts and the meta of them doesn't match anymore, like you change the script's name, the entire all mods that existed up to now stop working, just like that. And if you don't keep the original files with the mods, as Unity will not do for you, those mods are basically gone. They're unusable. Unless people downgrade a version, and then you have to start maintaining old versions of the games, or you have to choose to let mods die frequently, which is a gigantic hassle for most of the community.
Okay.
And also, one more thing here. If you use Unity as your modding platform, that means you don't have full control of your own modding platform's software and how optimized it is, or nor how flexible it is, what capacities it has to do. Which means if you want to add some major feature, you literally can't sometimes. If you make your own system, you have full control of it. You can do whatever you want.
The only thing I would say in its favor, though, would be the concept of authoring tools. Depending on the kind of game you're doing. If you're making Beat Saber or some other rhythm game, you would rather have someone work with like a JSON file or something they can configure the sequences and beats. You don't want them messing with an editor. But if you're making a skateboarding game, having to set up a spline with the appropriate, pathing around levels and stuff, you don't want to rebuild a poor versions of Unity Engine just so they can place meshes and then set up splines and all of that stuff. So arguably it depends what you're doing, but I would say in 99% of cases, exposing a minimum contract and model shapes and stuff that you would allow people to load into your game would be easier. It also gives you more control. But there are cases for both. But yeah, I would say 90% of the time, you're probably better off rolling your own. But again, some people do it, and it depends on your community, right? Like, yeah. I think that the perfect example is VR chat, because it's that case of like, it is entirely community driven. They're going to do whatever they have to do to get as much custom stuff as they like, and so they don't mind paying the extra conceptual cost to do that. And it also leads to like a sub-market in the classic like Roblox sense, where rather than actually doing it yourself, there are going to be people who will sell the ability to like, I will take a model that you give me and skin it and model it and set it up as a character for you. And so now you're sort of promoting that like community driven stuff that way. Again, depends what you want, but yeah, it happens.
Cool.
There's literally a website called booth.pm that has a 3D model section that's full of VR chat models. We're talking tens of thousands of them. There are sub-markets for single characters there. There is a character that has more than 1,000 pieces of clothing and hairstyles because people keep making it for that character. The bigger ones make it for multiple characters, and they get to enjoy like selling the asset for literally every single one of them individually. But
Wow.
Yeah, and
So
back in my day, I did something like quite frankly, I didn't want to take the time to learn how to set up their character rigs, so I paid someone to make me custom characters back when I was using it regularly. So it's like there are people who were doing that. So
All right. I'm going to hop off. I will see you all later.
All right.
Have a
Good
fantastic time.
seeing you again, Andrew.
You too.
Yeah, that's crazy. I remember when I first saw VR chat at a hackathon when they were like working on it early on, and I was thinking like, oh, that's kind of neat. That's probably never going to go anywhere though. It's like never take my predictions. They tend to be
I was even
wrong.
worse. I literally was in VR chat every week for about a year, and the whole time I was going, this is just a me. We basically just built a slightly fancier version of like a Skype call. It's just for ourselves to kind of play around. There was 12 of us consistently every week, and we're all in T-pose, all in the default characters, and it's basically just a fun way to like use your cat. Like I didn't think this was going to go anywhere. I was famously on record saying if there's ever going to be a Skype for VR, someone like Microsoft or whatever will do it. I don't think any small company is going to ever compete. And now we've got Meta's version sucks and VR chat's the popular one. So again, what do I know? You can never tell where that's going to go.
generally, being the first in these things makes for a very big audience.
Well, of course, in my defense, back then, if more than 4 people talked at once, the whole app would crash. So my expectations for what was possible were a bit different.
Different, yeah.
Oh.
So somebody asked about how to handle baking light maps, and I also want to lead with that question into going back on the spline thing you mentioned, Jason. When you have unique content for your levels in your game, the easiest thing you can do to let people mod the games is literally have a level editor within the game. Might sound incredibly difficult, but it's way easier for the users. They never leave the application. They know it's the official solution. It's easiest for them usually because you tailor it for regular users when it's part of the application. It forces you to think about these things as a kid that's no older than 15 is actually going to try this. Ergo, it must be easy to use. It's not like only modders in their 20s. So when you do that, it creates a far bigger and easier accessible crowd. That said, if you don't make something and you rely only on the things that you offer with official support, then first off, the modding support is limited. And secondly, if people want to make things, you have to start doing the actual support for everything. When it's unofficial, it's like everybody's on their own, but it also means you can actually dedicate the time for working on your game. And you don't have to also debug issues as a result of user-created content. Like
that's why proportionally the ones that tend to be the games which are content-driven. If your game is a content-driven game, you'll build internal tools anyway, and then the question becomes, it's much less work to polish those and add them as more consumable functions inside the app than having to make bespoke stuff when realistically you yourself are placing things manually. So it tends to be games that are already content authored by the editor themselves that will have those tools.
Yeah, and there is something very important to mention here. There are a lot of issues that developers work on that is internal tribal knowledge. When I say tribal knowledge, I mean it's going from developer to developer. Nobody ever actually documents this stuff. It's like a plague that ruins this industry, if I can say.
Probably in some wiki that nobody knows where it is, hidden off somewhere.
Sometimes it's even worse. Sometimes it's on a forum post that somebody says, I have the problem, and then fixed it and never says the description of how they fixed it.
Or it's in an email somewhere.
Yeah. So I want to bring this to light because when you are working on things, if you make official solutions for regular users, you have to start thinking about how to create solutions for this, make the problems explicit to the user, and then giving the user a path of least resistance to solve the problem, a path that's easiest to say. One very good example of this is Portal 2 had a map editor for multiplayer maps and user-generated content in general. And to create a level there, you had to make a valid puzzle, which means they had to validate if a puzzle is valid or not, which means they had to create an entire system that just validates your puzzle is not valid because reason. And here is where the problem lies. Go to the place and fix it. This entire system is not something trivial to create. It sounds very easy to do, but it means somebody had to start figuring out literally every edge case that would say, is this valid or not?
And you
That
can spot
doesn't
too
sound
that because it's not even just the obvious stuff like you'd say, oh, it's pathfinding. If you can't get to locations, then sure. It's like, but so it's based on a grid, and so they can basically do this, voxel pathing or whatever to detect that stuff. But the more complicated stuff is you'll notice they specifically designed it so that every time you have a switch to a door or something, you have to draw the line, and it may be visually aesthetic that they're drawing a line across the wall to match it, but what they're also doing is verifying that things can connect and things. So there's a lot of other stuff on top of the pathing, and also not to mention the game has knowledge of its own things like maximum velocities and stuff, and so it has to know what's actually plausible in terms of there's a lot to it that is quite interesting. I wasn't even aware of what they were doing, but I did notice when I was playing with it that you would do something that looks right and the game would be like, no, that doesn't work. And it's like, and you have to, now you're trying to figure out what you did wrong, and it's like, oh, of course not, because they wouldn't be able to do this thing. So it's smarter than you in a couple of cases where it'll catch you making these puzzles that look fine, but you don't realize you've actually made impossible for some reason.
Yeah, and just to answer the actual question that was in the post about the baking light maps. So light maps are literally just textures. Unity bakes them in a separate place and loads them in a separate place. I don't know if there is an API for that. You may need to do asset bundle level streaming, or just don't use light maps and let users bake the light and draw it however they want. It's a valid solution. Yeah.
Do any of those games have like manual reviews of user content? So for like level validation, where you have to have a human validate it and approve it for consumption. Like I used to play MUDs back in the day, and you get to a certain, you beat the MUD or whatever, and then you get added as like an admin, and you can create content for the MUD, but it still had to be approved by other admins.
Today, I don't know any mod system that requires a human to come and verify that the content is valid. That said, communities that have public portals for modding generally have a way to rank a mod. For example, Mods Nexus has liking and disliking mods, and the workshop also has a similar system, and they can add tags on the mods, whether it's funny or serious, etc.
Yeah, truth be told, like here's the super secret hot take as to why. If you have a game and people are making mods, people are going to screw with IP. They're going to do stuff that they shouldn't do. And if you make an announcement that says we are going to start verifying these, you are now on the hook, because you are explicitly saying we have to do this by the book, in which case you have to come down on those things. If you hands up and say, hey guys, there's a mod portal, this is a folder to put stuff into, go nuts, you are implicitly allowing for that without making it your problem, because as soon as you make it your problem, you have to start gating for it. So usually it's smarter to go with the community ranked based solution, because it means people can have more freedom, but you're not getting yourself in legal hot water.
And you generally don't have control on your game when you expose it to modding. As I said, literally anybody can hack it and put in whatever they want, whether it's just not fit for the game or straight up malicious. It's beyond your control as soon as you open the floodgates. That said, for official portals, you literally do need to take care that you're only allowing the things that would be generally allowed. So, for example, no other IP content on official grounds, whether it's forums or whatever. If you're hosting it, you literally can't go off the book.
Yeah.
Seems like a lot of good advice. Hopefully it's helpful for people in here making mods. I wonder how many people are actually going to put some mod stuff in their game. It'd be interesting to get a count. Do you have any idea, Yorai, like what % of games actually support modding?
I would wager with the amount of games that release per day, it's less than 1% is an easy guess. But
the % of games that have a budget, an actual budget, and
I would still say that it's less than 2%. That said, the games that do that are generally high profile in terms of like, this game saw it worth investing in having mod support, likely as an update because the initial release already had this much good content. Or when they worked on the game early, they saw that the pitch for the game is literally, I want to make more stuff in it because there isn't enough in the game, or I have such a great idea, you inspire me. There are games that
That's
do
what
that.
I was saying when I specifically mentioned the idea of content-driven games, because the truth is, if you're doing the calculus for is it worth it for you, I mean, I don't want to harp on the whole MMO argument again, but the point is still the same. If your game requires people to be successful, you're banking on that. And so what a lot of games will do, even Minecraft, one of the most famously moddable games in the world, they don't start by being a moddable game. They start by being a game, and people start doing stuff with it, and then they go, oh look, people are enjoying modding our game. Should we start supporting this officially? At which case they have to have that conversation. So only in the case where your own game, you're actively making tools to support it, does it make sense to launch with the concept of modding tools, because you're already, if it's only like a 20% pivot to go from we've built internal tools for map editing to could we expose these external tools and possibly make it easier, then it might make sense. But I think in 90% of cases, it makes a lot more sense to release your games. Don't like super encrypt everything and make it like relatively okay for people to play with your games. And then if there seems to be a community building around that, reach out to those people and maybe start helping them out with what they need from you, and then have a good working relationship. And if it still keeps growing, you could then make official mod support and maybe even hire people from the modding community and so on. And that builds up. I think it's a more organic process than a lot of other scenarios.
There's one more thing that's worth mentioning here, is that if you're committing to having mod support for your game, it's a very big time investment, and more importantly, it's an attention investment, because users who would want to mod your game are the users that engage the most with your game, to know enough about your game's internals to the point where they want to inject their own changes to a specific piece of content within that game. If you make an entire game that's like very story driven, there's almost nothing they can do to inject themselves aside adding stories on the side. But if you are making a content driven, like system driven game that has a bunch of levels, and those levels have different level design layouts, and the level design impacts how the player plays quite significantly, and there are a lot of mechanics that can be interacted with in interesting ways that you have not explored yourself, the players would start dissecting the systems to very granular degree and expecting you to improve them if they aren't up to par on what the players want. A lot of mods for most communities are fixes and adjustments to things that aren't ideal in the game according to the community's needs. And if you don't expose paths for that, you're going to upset an entire new audience that you didn't have before.
If you want a really simple example of this, to go back to the Minecraft days, Minecraft was built with a set number of items. That is all the items there are. That's all the items they need. And so they have a single list of available conceptual items with a max number count of how many items there are. And so, of course, once people start producing their own items, and lots of them in different mods, each item that you added to Minecraft, you had to choose an ID for. And so you can imagine the chaos when different mods were choosing different IDs to support their different things. And so effectively, modders had to create mod layers that would mod first things like creating item indexers that would auto handle icons and IDs that would you then have to mod on top of those, and you end up getting into this chaos because some of the earlier mod support requests were things like, we literally can't figure out how to not crash other people's mods by overriding their items and stuff. And so yeah, there's now new support tickets and items that have nothing to do with the game that you have to handle to manage just so other people can support mods.
This goes back to the thing I said about having dynamic content lists.
Well, one thing I will say, though, is a small addendum to all of this. If your stuff is in Unity, it's already slightly moddable. Just an FYI. Yes, there's like the layers on top of all this stuff we can talk about. But if people are sufficiently inclined or know what they're doing, you can open any Unity game, and mono game specifically, and you can pretty easily replace things like models or run your own snippets of code or modify how the code runs. There's a lot of other stuff on top of it, but like one nice thing is this is why personally I think a good litmus test is not to go hard on creating modding content first, because there's already a very rich Unity modding community that know how to get stuff into your game while it's running. It's not the same as like pre-building it and posting it and sharing it, but you'll be able to see if modding is happening. If you made a game and it's gaining traction, you'll be able to see people mod it even before you've even gone down the pipeline of officially supporting modding. So I mean, yeah, you can be prescient and have some plans in place for when these things might occur. But I would say if your game is likely to become, a mod friendly, like what I mean is, like, if you take indie horror games, they're not something you'd think of as a modding game because they're pretty like linear, simple stories. But for some crazy reason, they've got a huge modding community. So in those cases, it makes sense you wouldn't have thought of that up front, but yet you would have supported it later as time goes by. But again, if your game is a very content-driven, social streamer-based game, then yeah, maybe it does make sense to pre-plan some modding support. But I only bring all of this up to say, if you think modding might be an option down the line, again, people who are already into modding and will like your game will already be able to do some stuff with it, and so you can kind of see where that goes.
There is one more thing that you brought up. This is actually very important to mention. If your game has multiplayer and you want mod support, it's an entire new can of worms of diabolical level. Because not only do you have to support mods being loaded, you have to make sure that they are loaded in the same order. And then on top of all of that, you have to make sure that the packets that they send are recognizable by each other's content. And in Unity, most solutions for adding multiplayer require registering messages in a way that's done automatically for you, which means external packages literally cannot have them in a normal way. And on top of that, there is also recently a lot of multiplayer is being pushed into dots territory. Both the netcode for game objects, future versions being discussed having a backend working using dots, and just some games that are getting really popular, like V Rising, Wizard with a Gun, etc. They use dots on the backend, and dots uses burst, and burst is not part of the modifiable set of code that you have access to. The optimization that burst does for you, as great as they are for performance, they create a secondary file, and that file is what's getting used by Unity when you run the game. So if you want to be able to mod code that got bursted, you literally can't do that in the standard way. You have to delete the bursted file, literally all the content that got bursted loses all of its optimizations just like that. And then you can mod the game. And on top of that, some dots games also implement determinism because it's very easy to do with dots, which means if the single frame calculated things differently and the game goes out of sync, it disconnects the players, which really ruins the modding experience on top of like losing the performance. So you have to be really careful when you're using like the advanced packages. Every time that you accept magic that improves things on your end, sometimes it comes at the cost of making it like it makes it literally harder for everybody else unless you give them what they need to join your end, which is literally impossible in Unity's auto optimization set.
I think Greg's got to get going, right? And you can add some, go add modding to Highland Panic real quick.
I don't think so, no. But all this discussion does make me want to make some kind of a game with a level editor.
Yeah, so, it'd certainly be interesting. If you guys haven't checked out Highland Panic, go grab it on Steam and play it for a little while, and then leave a review. Let Greg know what you think, and help share it. And he talked quite a bit about the game and the development process on his YouTube channel. That's linked down below as well. So go check that out, and we will see you again soon, Greg. Thanks again for coming out.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
You too.
Cool. And pal, you've been kind of quiet lately, so I wanted to just pop up the I saw that the Black Friday, or not Black, the New Year's sale for the asset store is still live with some nature manufacturer assets 50% off. So to link that real quick, let everybody know, and see what you think about the modding stuff.
I mostly like to hear, Jason, you're like talking about it, so I mostly agree.
Me too.
I've done mods for several years when I was starting game development, so it was back then we mostly didn't have any mod tools. We had to go through code or to byte code to check what's hidden in the games and write it ourselves. Nowadays, I would agree that both if someone is using Unity and Unreal and you are quite good with it, you can mod any game that's using it. Yeah. For the example is the how it's called, UE VR, yeah, the mode that was released a few days ago that gives you VR support for almost all Unreal games, yeah. So they modded so many Unreal games with just one mod that it's possible to do if you have good enough knowledge about the engine you're trying to mod.
I mean, even back in the day when VR first came out, there was 2 different applications which literally just modded DirectX directly and would allow you to do things like detect the camera and make it stereoscopic. And so you were able to. That's how there was BioShock Original in VR before there was BioShock in VR.
And Skyrim, right?
Yeah.
Now there's limitations to that, obviously, because you get some fun quirks because it depends how it's done, or you go one step further where things like Dolphin VR, where they would mod the emulator itself, and then you'd have to have some quirks that would work, but then you'd have some interesting quirks where you can't interact with the culling system, so you're able to detach the camera, but it doesn't affect the culling frustrums, and so you're seeing things clip out. So there's a lot of the stuff there's ways around a lot of these things.
Yeah. Just to note down on Unreal Engine modding. So in Unity, the standard way that you mod is the game runs on an assembly DLL files set. And you can edit those DLL files and start doing whatever you want because it's IL code. You can literally bring it up to C#, decompile it, and change it as you wish. That said, some games run on the CPP side. The IL to CPP, and then you literally can't undo the changes. There is a project that's trying to. It's very limited right now in scope. There's a big reason why. But that's not.
I admit I do personally hate that. I mean, I get it. I understand why, but it does slightly really frustrate me when I'm decompiling games and I'm like, they went C++ on this one. And so it just makes it's annoying that I can't do the same stuff.
Yeah, but this is not the only part of content that those games have. The other part is the assets. And assets are not code, and they don't work by code standards. So Unity generally uses asset bundles. People tend to associate that with files that you download from the internet to update your game dynamically. It's not that. The asset bundles exist even on local Unity games. They're one of the subfolders within there. And you can literally unpack those bundles and edit the content within them. You will literally get to see all the textures, all the animations, all the character rigs, models, whatever you want. And with that knowledge, you can also change the contents of those asset bundles and even change the asset bundle map to include new bundles, and those bundles can also include code.
Or even simpler is if the changes you want to make are things like your classic unlimited health or whatever, you don't even need to do any of that. Yeah, because at the end of the day, your game is loaded into memory, and then you can effectively read the memory. And so I brought it up before, but I do think it's kind of fun because a lot of people don't realize they were doing it. Is your Game Sharks, any of your code things, or if you ever ran an emulator and you're watching the stream of hexadecimal code fly by trying to figure it out, the way those secret codes were created, they're not codes, they're references. So what you do is you run the game, you change a number. So that's why, you take damage, you see what changed, and you strip it down to the bytes that actually changed as a result of taking damage. And you're like, well, I guess that's the health bar. And then you just lock it at a value, and then that becomes your infinite health cheat because you can now effectively lock that value in. So back in the day, that's what a lot of hacks were. You would basically load the game, run it through this cheat cartridge. The cheat cartridge would take the code and siphon it through to the real game. But then intermediate, you would just say, actually, every time this byte comes through, swap it, and then and you'd end up basically locking the health. That's why unlimited health cheats will always give you a weird number. They wouldn't actually be unlimited or no damage. It would be health always snaps back or lives always 99 or something. Because what it's really doing is just keeping the number at whatever number it's supposed to be at.
Yeah, and also on that note, instructions in the code, like reduce health, are also part of the memory instructions. It's just the runtime memory of the game. And some advanced memory editing hacks basically change the instruction set to say never actually reduce health, or when you're supposed to set it to 1, always set it to 999. And the even more advanced ones say when you are running this piece of code, instead go to that other address where I inserted an entire new command in memory to actually load my packages, and then you add support for modding in runtime, which is a very fun.
Yeah, which gets into
Yeah.
even more wacky stuff about speedruns. You ever seen those weird speedrun hacks where people are running in circles and standing in certain spots? That's because they're basically memory mapping. They're doing a lot of really wacky things where Zelda's a good example of this because they recently found a bunch of them for a lot of the Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, for the way memory works in terms of what items held in your inventory. And so depending on where you are in the map screen will detect which warp point will work for a particular mask thing in so basically some of the tricks are you want to overrun to the neighboring register sets and then swap the memory. So there's a lot of this stuff is kind of crazy how it's even in running games without any external tools, you can mess with the memory if you understand where these overruns are happening, and you can then like feed into the neighboring parts. So it's an interesting field.
Yeah. There was something that I wanted to say, and now I forgot it, and it's irking me.
It happened to me too. Here, let's take this question real quick while you got? Do you remember?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So in Unreal Engine, the way that loading packages works is actually very interesting because they actually give you a way to pack mods by yourself, and it's literally mod files. And almost all Unreal Engine games by default accept files under a mods folder as long as they are a pack format. So users that install Unreal and start editing content in Unreal can literally make their own mod there, replace existing assets of the game if they register them the same way as the assets of the original game. Like if there is a character.material and you have a character.material under the proper subfolder and you make a pack of that, it will replace the character's material. But more interestingly, because most Unreal games have some amount of blueprints, you can replace the blueprints with ones that execute your code. And that leads you to do literally anything you want as long as it's in blueprint. And even more advanced is that you can customize Unreal Engine to introduce dummies of the blueprint nodes that the original game created for itself using CPP. And then you can add those dummy nodes and let the game load them as a pack, and then the game will run the proper code for gameplay using those blueprint nodes. So this is how you get the most advanced mods. It's particularly incredible in the Kingdom Hearts 3 community how they use that to do really wacky changes, like replacing the characters with entirely different ones, giving you the original movesets of those characters, changing the entire way the game works. It's insane.
Also, modding has just changed a lot too. If you go back to like original Super Nintendo games or whatever, or Game Boy, if you take original Game Boy, original Pokemon, interesting things about some of that stuff that you don't expect is there are no audio file packs of assets for you to just open and swap out, because all of the creature screeches and sounds in the original Pokemon were a combination of stacked waveforms. You would actually create an array of hold notes, create sawtooth wave, hold for this about, and they only had 3 to work with. They had the noise layer, I think a sawtooth, but basically you would stack them and that would be generative of each different creature. And so it literally didn't have the memory to load and play a wave file. And then later on, you've got stuff again. I go back to Zelda because I did a lot of research that back in the day. There would be things like wall textures, and you'd be like, I'll just replace the wall texture here. But that same piece of texture coordinate space would be used for like a character's knee or the back of their thigh, because they actually had a very small texture space, and they would be reusing things you wouldn't think of, where actually the same like geometric shape would actually be like 17 different things, ranging from parts of trees to walls to like characters' clothes, but they're reusing the same portion. So yeah, it gets into weird territory, and that's why like more modern games which have those large like sidecar asset files are much easier to mod, because you can, as long as you can unpack it, you can then swap out content and put them back in again.
Yeah, it also gets a lot into content packing for performance reasons. Like some games would have a giant Atlas texture that includes all the textures of the game, just for the sake of saving on the memory costs of having like swapping between textures and performance reasons, etc. And on that, Terraria, for example, manually draws textures. We don't have any content data system. Every single thing in the game is a manual draw call of a specific frame, of a specific texture as we specify. And when we do VFX, there are a limited number of textures that we reuse heavily. So it's hard to replace them because literally everything is pointing to the same texture in the code. It's not like there's multiple assets that point to the same texture, so you can replace the pointing to another texture for specific assets. It's all the same asset. So if you try to replace one of the flash effects, for example, a lot of things that you didn't even think would be replaced suddenly get replaced, like water droplets.
Which doesn't even get into things like resolution issues. Like, to go back to original Minecraft again, they had a sprite sheet that would represent all of the different tiles, and it's like, oh, I just want to make a higher resolution version of the grass. It's like, well, good luck, because you've literally got your 16 pixels for it, and if you want to switch the size of the atlas, you have to make a new atlas and then make a new loader for the new atlas that changes all the dimensional coordinates for each tile across it. So it's a lot harder to do that than just to say, I'll open it in Photoshop and paint over the details. So there's, if not only that, but if you're using a sprite sheet, you are often just storing it as array coordinates for the different tile sizes. And so it even depends what kind of packing you're doing. Are you packing it into an actual sprite sheet of equal tiles, or is it just bundled into one asset with different coordinate rectangles predefined? It's it can get messy.
Yeah.
But all of this to say, when I just came in, something that you said I want to just highlight, because it was the first thing I heard when I joined, was you mentioned it's easier with just files. Brutally honest, 90% of the time, that's usually how I tend to start my modding of something. The example I used was the game Death's Door, the little the bird that's kind of in the isometric view. It's a really fun game. I finished it. I got all but 3 things, and I was very annoyed. It was too much work to go get the 3 things. So I opened the text file, and the text file was they were using the binary formatter, and so it's kind of annoying to edit the binary file. So I decompiled the code, found the saver script, and I just exported it, and then I decompiled it myself into a text file, modified the text file, and then recompiled it back into its original byte format, and then loaded that old save file in. So it's much easier for me to just modify the text of the save file than to do memory mapping nonsense that I would have to do otherwise. So a lot of the times when it comes to modding stuff, or for myself, I want to say modding because it's more allowing for modifications for myself for testing or editing, I just always have a button that says spit this out as a JSON array. I write custom JSON serializers, and I can say export this as an array for each cell. Then I can change the numbers, load it back in again. It's much quicker, much easier, and serves for 90% of the cases I personally have, or rather than writing in values for things, I would have index numbers. So this is tile 5. What is tile 5? Well, I go to the tile grabber and get tile 5, and then something else resolves to a repository that contains a bunch of tiles. And if I want to mod that or structurally change it, I would swap out the resolver, and it would take different tile 5. And that way I've drawn an application boundary to swap the two.
That's actually incredible now that you remind me of that. There is a lot of work that revolves around tool making for mod making. Just literally interpreting and understanding everything. There's literal entire community pages about mapping out different pieces of the game, trying to know hey, if you're looking for these specific assets, they're actually named that way, because the game files wouldn't actually tell you. It's not oh, this is the one time that the third boss is actually pulling out a shield, and it's the green one, not the red one. This is the file. It's A13, B18, C. I don't know. It's those file names, they give me an aneurysm sometimes because it's really difficult to version them. What is a JSON serialize?
It makes stereo for Jason for when he's hungry. Feeds him in the morning. Sorry, I missed part of that conversation. I had to go grab lunch real quick. So is there more UGC stuff you guys were going into, or did you want to take these questions that popped up too?
Let's take some questions, I think.
All right. Yeah. I didn't want to interrupt. Like I said, I kind of came in on the back end of that for the last couple minutes. So there was one. Well, I'll take them in order. This one from Justin about when working on an RPG game with large amount of data or items, would using a SQLite database be a good idea, or is a scriptable object database a good way to go? Let me hide the chat overlay so we can read this and see ourselves.
So this one has a question behind a question, because when you have a scriptable object, it's a data declaration of everything that defines the object, which means in order to know that it exists, when you load that scriptable object in, you load literally everything about it. So having this large database to know about all the items would require that the entire database is loaded, which means the entire game's content is loaded, which is not what you want. With
Well, it could be. It depends on what they mean by large.
That was actually going to be my very first question. Because when I saw that, like, large to one person is 1,000. It's like, ooh, or 10,000 or 100,000. It's like, well, funnily enough, anything under 20,000 is probably like small, right? It's once you get into the millions that you have to start thinking about bigger stuff.
I disagree, because the point is not the amount of items necessarily, it's what they actually lead to. Because a single piece of content in a scriptable object can reference 1,000 different materials that also reference, I don't know, 1,000 different textures that each take 20 megabytes of memory. You load that one.
Personally, okay.
It shouldn't, but it can,
Yeah, I was going to say,
it doesn't have to.
Whenever I talk about items, I always talk about a data declaration of items. I will always have their instant strings. I will never have items in my database be textures, be materials, be whatever. So whenever I talk in those numbers, to be clear, but yes, you're right. If someone is making a database item that is actually textures and materials, that's what you're talking about. It's a whole different scenario.
Yeah, and the scriptable object is no different in that regard than a fully loaded item. So if you have a large amount of items that each of them has a full presentation within your world, and that presentation is more than text, you actually want to load the smallest amount. Then it becomes a question of, do you actually care about having an entire database loaded at once if it's just a very small content per entry, or do you actually want to be able to like query for it and wait for the results? When you have it all loaded at once, it makes some queries for runtime way easier, like find the item with the most damage. Literally far faster. If the entire database is loaded, you can literally scan for item that has the highest attack amount and return that. But if you have a SQLite database, you actually have to start querying for it and like waiting for the results to come back to you, if I remember the entire thing correctly. So by the nature of most of these databases not being entirely loaded at once at the same time. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, it would still be pretty fast though in the SQLite database. You just index that.
Well, okay. Well, actually,
it wouldn't be as fast as in memory, but yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing, because this is actually something that came up in some other conversation I had probably about 2 weeks ago, and I find it funny because I caught me off guard. It's one of those, like, you realize, I don't want to call it that curse knowledge thing, but I think we're all talking about this stuff with a certain level of understanding. I think we have to dial back a little bit, because I had a conversation with someone that really made me rethink this. When people hear database, they think it's like there's small data, you put in files, there's big data, you put in database. That's kind of how most people seem to be perceiving the concept. But what I want to be clear about here is databases are just a way of storing data. And as weird as it may sound, it can be more efficient and faster to store it in plain text files than it can be to store in a database, depending on circumstances. So what you should be aware of is what a database is actually for, and it's not for storing lots of stuff. That's not what a database is actually for, as weird as it sounds. In general, you have, your game has stuff, you want to load stuff, and you can put that stuff anywhere you like. The concern that you're always talking about is the fact that the more of that stuff you load up and have to hold with you, the more you're dealing with the cost of the memory of all of that stuff present with you at all times. You want to avoid that where possible. You want your like working memory to be as small as possible relative to the stuff you're doing. But there's a reason why traditionally what people do is they have tiered solutions. And so if you want to store lots of stuff and go, over the course of my game, there's 10 million items that someone may come across, well, that can be stored somewhere. And that somewhere can literally be anywhere. That can be text files, that can be databases, that can be whatever you like. The real question becomes is when you go to use that data at game time, how much do you load and how do you deal with it? And that gets to the second tier above it, which is I load the data I need and then I start doing things with it. And you get into queries. Now, the point of a database, and well, different kinds of ones do different things, but SQL is specifically chosen for being a query language, structured query language. It's used for databases where the actual benefit isn't even the queries per se. It's the fact that the data is stored in a way which allows it to be queried and combined in interesting ways. Because traditionally, data is stored in a lump and you pull the lump back. But a database allows you to store striped data in lots of different ways. You can get a query that combines part of this and part of this and part of this, reconstitute a brand new object, and return the object. It's why it's often used for things that are like banks and databases of stuff, like that you're like a YouTube channel or Twitter, where you're storing things where you're pulling back columns of structured concepts together in these different sets. For games, though, there's often that intermediate memory layer where you might have 10 million items, you load up the 100,000 things that are relevant to the current town you're in, and then you deal with those in a smaller compressed space. And I won't go through the whole pipeline, but suffice to say, memory management is a big part of databases. But then the part that people really think about, they're like, how do I find the data? That's actually a different problem on top of that. That's a search problem. And a search problem is often dealt with something like a search server or Redis or something else completely different than the storage problem. So when people say databases, it's not a one slot solution. There is long-term persistence, memory persistence, querying on top of that, and then the usage of that data in memory as you go. And oftentimes a long form solution would be some form of save files, some form of database, some sort of search server like Lucene into something like an in-memory collection of scriptable objects for local resident cache that you're using, into some sort of resolver with a flyweight that would turn that stuff into view models, and then the view models you actually use. So I only bring all of this up to say that we're kind of mildly talking past each other because we're actually talking about 15 different things we know what we're describing, but the actual pipeline is a lot longer with a lot more steps than just, do I use SQL or do I use text files? So just, I really wanted to get that bit clear because I think that was kind of lost in translation.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, well, and you can maybe hit this on whatever you're gonna say there, but I was just curious what you guys all think the benefits of a database route would be. Like, where's the point where you'd be like, yeah, I would definitely use a database at this point, or maybe consider it at this point, like where you would consider a SQLite or something like that. And then you're at whatever you were going to go to. Sorry.
Yeah, no, to answer your question, when I would go for a database, usually I would do that in games where a lot of content needs to be available at once. And the reason I'm saying
what would you define as a lot?
More than, it's rather arbitrary, but when you have to load more than half of your games total, and that games total is like in the thousands.
Okay.
The reason I'm saying that is because if you don't have a lot, most of the data is simply small. Numbers are tiny. Text is little. But materials, textures, models, shaders, animations.
Sorry, it's my daughter's pony.
Yeah, I know. It's just, it brought back a memory. Anyways, the actual content assets that present the items or the actual content that you have on the renderer, those are the things I would be wary of, and I would literally just segment them as one data binding for the entry. If I can do that, literally everything else can be on the database. If I intend to use a lot of it and start asking questions about a lot of it, I would literally use the database to cache and make those things available quickly. As we said, random searches for like the item that has the highest damage, or sorting items by damage, so an AI can make a decision to use the best weapon against you, stuff like that. When you want to make those queries faster, you use a database for that. For the actual content, as Keith mentioned in the chat, letting the actual address of the item's heaviest content be separate and loaded individually as it's needed is great, specifically if your game doesn't need a lot of it at once. Like if you're doing a character customization system, but generally you go into a dungeon, nothing more than the 6 to 10 enemies that are in there and their weapons and the drop in the boss's chest. If that's all the content that you have, that's literally all the content that you need to load. For that, just load the full items. Literally everything else should not be loaded or loaded only on demand. Like if you're looking at the inventory and you're inspecting a sword, load the sword model, present it. Once it's gone, remove it. Let the data that the sword exists always be loaded separately, but the actual presentation of the sword loaded individually on demand.
I think that's the bit that a lot of people get most confused about by this. I always go back because I think Minecraft is such a clear-cut example of this more than anything else. Is that we've talked before? There's a concept called the flyweight pattern, and it basically means that if I'm storing a chunk, so a Minecraft chunk, depending on which era you go to, because they've changed sizes from 64 to 256 upwards as time went by. We'll pretend it's 256 because I think that was the common for the most amount of time. If you've got 256 by 256 blocks, that is a chunk of information in the game. And broadly, the way Minecraft would work is it would use all of its generators and it would spit out a stack of these different blocks with the different weights and the different distributions. Then the player would come along and hack away at it and make changes. Now, step one, how much of that do you have to store? Do you have to store all the blocks? No, because you can regenerate all the blocks back to where they were. All you have to do is store the change set on top of those blocks. So you take the list of modification changes and you store those and you save those out. But how much information do you have to store? Do you have to store the colors, the textures, the whatever? No, you have to store what the block is now at that coordinate in the block size. And so the amount of information you need to save to reconstitute back a player carved out cave in a Minecraft level is exclusively the blocks they have changed by ID in an array, and that's it. And everything else can be reconstituted back at the time of reloading into the game. And also, the cool thing about this is if you don't modify a chunk, you don't have to do anything with the chunk, which is why in Minecraft, the save file is directly proportional to the amount of stuff you load and modify as you go. If you run in a straight line and start modifying stuff, the save file will grow exponentially with it. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that because they do caching of things you go through. There's other bit state flags and whatever, but broadly, that's kind of the structure we're getting at here. And so the mistake that I'm kind of getting at that people make is they conflate their data with their presentation layer. And so when you're storing out data, you don't need to store 500 bits of fact about that information. You need to store exactly what you need to rebuild it back in whatever way you want to. And oftentimes, depending on the structure of your system, that can be something as simple as a number. It's like, that was 5. That thing there was the 5th thing. What's the 5th thing? Well, that's not my problem. I'm storing that thing was the 5th one. And something else is a list of stuff, and you're saying, get me the 5th one. And so if you're loading your game up and it's Christmas and you've loaded the Christmas sprite sheets, you're loading the 5th sprite sheet, which is the snowy grass. And if you're loading it during Halloween, you're loading up the 5th sprite sheet, which is the grass with the pumpkin on it, right? So you don't need to store the data of the literal textures and tiles. And that's why even the question of just, should I use SQL? It's more complicated because it's a numbers question. Because if you're storing 5 million fives, that's a very different statement than you're storing 5 million arrays of byte arrays of blobs of textures for different things. So yeah, it comes down to how you think about your data.
Horse does not approve. I have no idea what makes that thing just randomly nay. I
think it's just agreeing with me. I think that's a factual. I think that's
yes, Jason. Yes. I had to bring it on screen next time. Oh. No, I just want to interject real quick and mention that, like, for me, the point where I would consider using something like, I think first off, like separating the data, like you guys mentioned, it is exactly the core part. You want to minimize that stuff. Put a byte in there or a string at the most, but not big amounts of data. But for me, going to a database is much more about the data manipulation and management side of it than anything else. It's because there's relatively good tooling for databases, and it's easy to, if you're familiar with them and you're comfortable with them, like I've got way too much database experience, it's easy to do lots of really nice stuff with large amounts of data, querying it, updating it, and generating it and stuff. That's a little bit harder to do with scriptable objects. So, I mean, you obviously can do like an interface between them. But for me, I would say that if I'm putting in, a game where I've got maybe it would have to be over 1,000 items. I'm thinking probably like 5 to 10,000 things that I'm trying to deal with or more. I would start to at least consider a database for it, and it would also depend on the complexity of that data. If it's just small, tiny little data things, then I might not. But if it's lots of stuff, and especially if I've got multiple other people working on stuff, designers and stuff that are putting in content, it might just give them a nice, easy web interface to drop stuff in and load all of that in directly in the database. And when it gets to a very large scale, it becomes a lot more useful. If you get to the point where you've got 30, 40 people working on stuff, you have to come up with some data pipelines. It's either got to be built into the editor, and then probably with some extra tooling and some really good processes, or really common is having some external tools, some database tools, or external in-house built custom tooling for managing data. When you've got like 30, 40, 50 designers working on content, having them all trying to modify obviously like a scriptable object or a single blueprint or some data objects in the engine tends to be really difficult. You have to really put some stuff together there. So it's all kind of a matter of scaling, but I would always just start with scriptable object, and then when that is not sufficient, scale up to something else.
This is funny. This is one of those rare examples where even I would go simpler than you in these cases, rather than going the complicated one. Because for me, for databases, even for 5,000 items, I would probably still use JSON files or JSON lines specifically, or each one will be a line item in a single JSON file.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would too if it was just like regular items. It's just around that point is where I would start to maybe consider it, but it would still have to require it would have to have a really good use. Like I would have to be needing to do large updates or need external tooling of stuff. If it's just I'm loading those in, then I'll probably just pull it all in.
Well, that goes back to, again, like what I was saying is like the databases are not for what people think they are, or at least not certain ones. There are database. When I say database too, like a lot of people roll in their eyes. It's like, does he mean graph databases or SQL databases, or is he talking about NoSQL databases? Like, databases isn't even just one.
Well, in this case, it was SQLite.
Yeah. And so if we're talking SQL and SQLite, because the reason you use it is specifically for querying. Like, I don't want to get into the whole concept of normalization, but like the benefits of using a SQL database isn't just the fact that you store data. It's the fact that you can store data in a normalized form. And that means that you can query against multiple axes to compose interesting questions. It serves a completely different purpose. It's actually like, it's for long-term storage and query. It's not even for short-term query. When I say query, I don't mean query like a search box or query like in Skyrim searching my items. It's not even for that. It's for long-term query about modifying someone's account information across an entire social media platform. It's those levels of querying. So oftentimes it does support long-term storage, but even long-term storage, it's like there's multiple layers to that too. So like even for short-term storage, I would be using inverted indexes far more likely. I would be using some sort of in-memory storage solution, and then I would just be making my own inverted indexes on top of that, possibly using something like Lucene or whatever. But the point is, a SQL database is a way to store lots of data, but like it makes sense if you're storing lots of items. Again, going back to like a MMO or something, the reason why you might use a database there is not that you're storing items. It's that you're storing items striped by regions and drop rates and types of weapons with different classes, with different creatures that have different stuff. You're storing information where it's useful to do complicated concept queries to load into data, certain subsets based on where people are. It's the query, it's the CRUD operations.
I would also add one thing that you could add to it. If you're making MMO, so bigger games, you could store also analytics to that data. So you can connect this data that you stored with items, players, and everything, and then run analytics. Who is using what items are used mostly, and so on. And then that's a lot of data that you have to store. The other solution I sometimes use with games, earlier before I used assets, we had designers that loved to use SQL databases to check everything if it's connected, and we did it that way, that we created scriptable objects that were saved. Data from them was saved to the SQL database, but only during production. So they will check the data, use it, and when the build was going, it was getting data from database, storing into scriptable objects, and then building it, or storing in different kinds of data storage that was better used for that project. Yeah. So sometimes you can use SQL data for querying. Exactly. For storing data, if you're not using complicated queries, I wouldn't mostly use SQLite. Yeah, I would go with JSON. I would go with my custom data or something like that. Because if you don't use the main specification of SQL database, then you shouldn't use it.
And the other side of it too is validation for if you have so if you're doing something that has financial implications, or you're doing stuff which has account management of any kind, really, and you want to be extra careful, there is often audit trail requirements, especially if you're dealing with anything regulatory. But basically what you can do with databases, which is particularly nice, is you can have delete flags. You can have a column in your database that basically says is no longer valid, or has an internal delete date of a certain amount, where you actually never delete things for up to a year or more. And so you effectively restore, and certain database systems, if you're using like a migration solution, will actually store the operation changes, not just the data. They will store the state swaps across each different one. So not only can you go back and say this happened, you can say this happened because these sequence of events occurred. So databases are great for not just long-term information, but for that sort of querying back and forth. And to the point about JSON files too, a lot of people think when I say JSON file, it's like, oh, one big file. It's like, it doesn't work like that. Like, to go back to what Yorai said earlier regarding like loading it all to memory, you don't want to do that either. You don't want to load a giant JSON array of 10 million items into memory. That's horrible. But what people don't realize too is you can store your file as JSON lines, where every line in a file is a JSON object that represents a single entry in a hypothetical database. And so what you do is all you have to store in memory is the present index and the page size, and then you can iterate and load a page into memory from the file incrementally as you go. And there is a cost to opening disk and reading from disk, but reading from disk once for even 2,000 items is relatively small if you follow the earlier stuff we said of just storing these individual small chunks of data and reconstituting them against some sort of like flyweights or whatever.
Yeah, and there have been some questions in the chat that have piled up, and I do want to answer them while addressing one more thing that's really worth talking about here. One of the main points of having a big database using SQLite, etc., it's literally that you have the durability to survive changes, but more than that, there are common patterns to addressing concurrency in that database as it changes, which is something that we haven't touched here. Most of the content that people are talking about when they're making games is content that's not going to change. Ergo, it does not need 90% of the functionality of SQLite.
I have been actively avoiding concurrency related stuff. I kept about to say it. I was like, let's just get into big territory.
So the reason I'm bringing this up is that people have been bringing up here items that have randomized stats and items that change if you're using scriptable objects and you close the game and you reopen it, all your changes are lost. None of this gets addressed by just having an SQLite database. If you ship a game and you're trying to load a file of a database that does not exist, the game will not have content. So you're shipping the game with an existing database. You don't want that database to change for the game permanently after you start playing it, because now you don't have support for save files, or your game is literally permanent once you start it and there are no options to restart. You will have to address serialization of that database separately, any of its changes. Even if you use SQLite or scriptable objects or anything, you have to serialize what got changed in your item's existing definitions and then load it back in. Now,
you can have a separate database, right? You just have to have a separate database for each one. It wouldn't, you should have that as totally separate files.
Now, to address the thing about randomized stats, this is where we're getting back into the flyweight pattern. When your item has a definition for what it is constituting of, like legendary hero sword, and then you want to have 10 of them, they're still all the same legendary hero sword. The only thing that would change by the nature of having randomized stats is how you present that item and what runtime data do you actually want to have about that item? But those are all instances of that single legendary hero sword with some modifications. Now, regardless of whether you're using scriptable objects or the SQLite or whatever, it's literally just instances of data. And you can create as many of them as you want. As long as you serialize them and load them however you need, you can do literally anything you want. So,
sorry to interrupt, but if it's random and it's a randomized item, can't you just store the seed with the item and be done and
I was about
regenerate?
to get into that.
Okay, so just making sure I'm not missing something. Go ahead.
So when you have an instance of that item and you want to give it randomized stats, literally the only thing you need to do is isolate what will actually be changed as a result of that item getting randomized and keep that information. The thing that generates that end data can always be the same core data. Like if you're running the same process of, okay, I rolled a 6, ergo I'm looking at the table and it's a flaming sword, so flaming legendary hero sword. You don't need to store, now it has +6 damage, now it's also applying fire effects, now it's also going to burn the tree when you swing. You just store a single byte that says, I rolled a 6. And then it leads to, okay, this will always be flaming. As long as you don't change that rule set, the sword will not change. If you do want to guarantee this sword is flaming, keep a data that points to this is the flaming effect. And then this will never change.
Of course, the problem is most people don't manage a consistent set of seeds across their randomizers, so that's a whole different problem to solve.
Yeah, this is why I said if you want to guarantee the actual end result, you guarantee the actual end result. There's a
versioning. You keep versions of the saves too, and then
if you keep a version of the randomizer, you can keep a version of the entire randomizer. This is a complex topic that's worth discussing separately. The point being, the item might have a million data topics about it. This is the legendary hero sword. The description is that it's from 1,000 years ago. At one point, this was touched by a great necromancer. Ergo, it's actually effective against that necromancer, etc., 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 etc. All those lines are not unique to that instance of the legendary hero sword. If you have 10 legendary hero sword that all point to that necromancer, great. But you don't need to store that information. So the actual item can just be item pointing to legendary hero sword and roll the 6, ergo it's flaming. Literally that's it. A tiny piece of data. And even if you have 80,000 of those, you don't need a database for it. This is just such a tiny data piece. You literally don't need such a complex setup just to make it exist. And to prove a point, in Terraria, a chest can hold up to 40 items. A single world in Terraria can hold to something, I think, we had it at 1,000 chests at one point. So that alone is already 40,000 items. And then every player can store like 250 items on them, I think. I'm losing the numbers because we keep increasing them. Inventory inflation. You can have so many items at runtime. It's crazy. And that's per world. And that's not even including the items that you just throw around, like every dirt block that you mined that you didn't have the inventory space to pick up, so you're leaving it there forever to rot. All of those items are full item instances. And we don't need any database to query for those. We know how to define a single dirt block, and we can literally keep an instance of a dirt block in memory somewhere when we want to ask about dirt blocks. We don't need the unique dirt block every time. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to point out. The entire concept of serializing an item or randomizing an item or making changes to a data set, you don't need all that. If you just have a bunch of items that are in runtime and they're all pointing to the same core item and that you can recreate the exact end result that you want every time just from the basic data pieces, you can literally simplify the entire thing. And
which is why I always go back to the concept of repositories, because at the end of the day, no matter what happens downstream, if you have a thing that says item getter and you have an ID and you pass ID to item getter, it can resolve to that item. It can resolve to that item either by grabbing it from a disk in a cache. It can grab it by going to 4 different locations, composing an object, creating a view model and returning the view model, or it can resolve it by running the randomizer, getting the seed, doing whatever, and getting you back the item. And so it's worth thinking about your information in terms of there is data, There is questions you have on the data, and then there's stuff in the middle. And that stuff in the middle can be various layers of caching solutions relative to the kinds of questions. And when you get to really big scales, you're often storing duplicates of the data in multiple databases for serving different purposes. Well, I won't go down the whole rabbit hole because it was briefly mentioned, but there was vector databases mentioned. You use vector databases when you want semantic connections between information. If the kind of questions you're asking are like questions. You use graph databases when you want to search information based on relevance in terms of like set theory type stuff, where you're doing things like this director also directed these movies. You would use a NoSQL database if you're storing stuff by index caches, where you basically have indexes pre-built for I'm always going to query by this item in this location because I'm always saying, get me the swords for this shop. Then you would use a SQL database if you're going to be using CRUD operations across multiple complex data sets with different subsets of individual normalized fields. So each one serves a purpose relative to its own use case and type. And oftentimes you'd be using multiple for different things. So the short answer to that original question, or shouldn't you be thinking in terms of abstractions? Yes, that's what I always say for that reason, because all of these things are different solutions for different things. But the one truth is usually the same, which is somewhere in your code, you're going to say, get me stuff. And I have some identifier for that stuff, get me this one. And as long as your code works against that concept, everything else is what's called an implementation detail. It results entirely dependent on what device you're on, what machine you're on, what are you bound by memory? Are you bound by disk space? What do you like? There's a million and one questions. And so resolving to that contract first is usually a smart move.
Yeah.
One more thing about getting close to the metal and actually integrating like without abstractions. A lot of people are very afraid when they start making their first dynamic item system that they have to remember the exact thing about the item that they generated. Like it has 17% life steal instead of 18. The people that do that, perfectly fine to do. The problem is when you want to start balancing a game, because if you ever plan to support a game after having released it and you decide 17% is too much, I need to nerf it to 15, if you actually saved the number and not how you got to that number, like this was a perfect roll, you literally cannot nerf it. That item is now forever locked in the overpowered state unless you decide to manually modify and bring it down, or just changing the stat altogether.
But the inverse is true as well, though. If you do it the other way, then you can get stuck in a position where if you do want to, you can't reconstitute back, right? Because you can get stuck in both scenarios. If you either store the number and then you're stuck with that number, or if you store the generator, but the generator changes and now it no longer matches with the original number.
What if you're in a selector situation where they're picking the modifications?
All of that doesn't matter. The thing I'm pointing at is you want to remember the nature of what they got, and then separately the success of how they got it. If you have rolling for random stat and there are 10 options and the 10th option is lifesteal, you can keep lifesteal and then how much lifesteal, a perfect roll, the worst roll, a middle roll. And then if you nerf the item from having 5 to 17 to 4 to 15, and you bring it out to 15, the item will now have 15, but it's still the perfect roll. You still have the guarantee this was the perfect item. And it's even better if you show the players those ranges so that they can math out that they still kept the perfect item. The nature of how the player will remember the item is what's important, not the actual fine details of which number this is. If it's a perfect lifesteal, it's still going to be a perfect lifesteal. If you want to remove lifesteal altogether and you kept the nature of in the table of 10 results, this was the lifesteal result, you can still change that to something else and the players will just have to cope. At that point, it's like a major change and you just clarify that to the players. You can even do a certain thing where you say, I am changing this now. This is no longer what it was. The ID is different. I kept lifesteal, but there is no longer lifesteal on this table. Give the player something to reroll to something else. Like you can literally do that as an option as long as you kept the nature of what they're doing instead of the actual implementation detail.
Yeah. This comment right here, variations on known stats is one thing, but totally unique effects is something else, like on hit effect that spawns interdimensional tentacles. It's the same. It's
The fact that you can
essentially.
write it like that means you could write that word into something, or you could write the generator
literally,
for that word. So the same
I
thing.
would just store like if so. I mean, I built a bunch of systems in the past where I had to do like item modifications, enchantments, and other things, and almost always sometimes they were random, but the more typical ones were like, a player can put these different things in and combine something, anything from like crafting up an item to taking a sword and just adding in some enchantments that give some extra damage or give extra effects. And those are always in the small scale, you can store it as like a bit field of which thing is on the item. But the bigger situations, we've seen shitloads of them, and it's a little bit too big for that. You just have like a list of the modifications for the item. So you have like the base item ID and then whatever the modifications were, whether they were a mod ID that adds strength or a mod that adds some random effect or a mod that adds multiple other things. And you're just keeping those on. And then if you change those modification things in the back end later, it'll update for all of the people who have that mod. And then sometimes you go about offering them the ability to undo and redo those things if you made some drastic change, at least in MMOs. Single player, you may not care, but
like the thing is, just to be clear too, is that the original question about databases, like I really want to draw a sharp line, is the idea that databases are purely about the questions of storing and recall and all that stuff. Once you get into things like, but what if I want to store this infinitely complex set of whatever, that's not a storage question anymore. As long as you can describe that in some format that can be stored, you can store it and restore it. What we're getting into now is the questions of complicated stuff, and that complicated structure is actually more of a syntax tree problem, and that's a different thing. Where if you actually, without, again, I don't want to go way too down rabbit holes, but when you have autocomplete in your code editor, how is it autocompleting? That's technically an infinite, malleable, changing system of rules that you're building up as you code in terms of this follows this with this in it, with this underneath it, and then that has this. You're doing that. You're building this system, but it's saving it and it's restoring it somehow. And it's doing that because what you're building behind the scenes is a syntax tree. And almost everything that gets into that level of complexity, like lexers or any of those, do the same thing. They basically say, even a calculator, you could store not just the result of a calculation, you can store every step of a mathematical equation by storing it as terms. And terms are the individual portions of you add this, you remove this, you put this in brackets, you do that, and you build up a tree structure. And that tree structure can then be evaluated and compiled or done different things with. And so what you get from there is the concept of rule engines. And so broadly, if you do have a generative game where you can attach different things and modify custom spells, what you're really doing is building a custom rule engine, which states, I have these possible things, I have these possible predicate and conditions, I have these possible actions, and then I have these Boolean operators of ands and ors and whatever, and I stack these together. If this and this or this, put this and this and whatever, and you've now built a tree. And you take that tree and you resolve the tree out to a serialized form, which basically means can be described in a linear fashion, and you take the serialized form, and then we start the previous discussion. How do I store a large serialized form of information? So they're two completely different universes of problems. They do obviously have to intersect at some point, but the questions in one do not relate to the questions in another. You can use the same technologies regardless of which one. There's some that are more optimal. So for example, if you're storing data in a tree, you might want to use a database that represents stuff similarly in trees, or you might use a tree-based cache of some kind for sorting through it. Or if you're storing graph-related data, you store it in a graph database. Without, again, don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but you know the way in Google you type searches, like you type in a movie and you'll get a whole list of results, but you'll also get like other movies this person was in and other actors this person knows. That's actually two different databases. Behind the scenes, they use free GraphGL for that. So they literally are querying two separate databases, because the way to get information about what directors worked with this actor or what movies was this actor in is much simpler if stored in a visual graph. I say visual, but like you have a movie, you have actors work with directors work with other actors. It's so much easier to walk that tree and find the results than to like calculate a complex database. So the way you would return results of a linear search based on a query of like what is topically relevant about this person might be some sort of date processed version of a NoSQL database. But the way you would store that other data is in a graph database stored nearby. So again, sharp line. There's generating complicated data, seeds and randomizers, taking that complicated data, serializing it into forms that can be stored and structured, and then the questions of how do you store and structure it in such a way that I can store it and return it later, and then queries that I get it back later, and then how do I query efficiently by moving from the metal in memory into my local caches, and then you have different kinds of stuff in there to deal with the idea of having short-term RAM caches versus long-form disk caches. So we're bouncing around. I want to be clear that we are actually talking about like 15 different layers of different questions in tech here. So make sure we're talking about the right parts, you know?
There is a lot that I can say, but I will refrain because this literally opens up the gates to the abyss.
I'm also biting my tongue because no, I'm not going deeper into this kind of talk.
Because I always get worried. Because again, I always go back to this thing of like, what is somebody listening to? Someone who asks a question, should I use a database? What do they know? And once we're talking across these boundary lines, and I'm just like, I want to make sure that when we start talking about like object trees, we're being very clear that we're not talking about the serialization stuff and whatever. Because I know a lot of this stuff is like very. It can sound like we're talking about the same thing, but it's not. These are like different fields. There's people hired for one of these slices for their entire lifetime, you know.
If I can go back to one of the more basic questions, somebody earlier mentioned on hit effect equals spawn whatever. That's still literally something that can be represented as a simple stat. Like everybody thinks, oh no, this is supposed to be running a script, but who prevents the script from running except like if number more than 0, and the player generally has a spawn interdimensional tentacles equals 0, and that legendary item actually gives you +1 to that number, and now the if check can go, if that number more than 0, spawn interdimensional tentacles when the player hits an enemy. That's literally what tends to happen. Those items that enable special effects for most games, because the games tend to be very simple and data light, literally they would just increase that number, and also those items tend to have a randomized amount of damage for how those tentacles hit. They will just randomize that damage, and you will have any item give that to the player. It's not like the player only has one weapon and the weapon on hit effect equals that, ergo when that code specifically runs, it checks for the weapons on hit and deals the damage. No, some players might have 2 swords that give them that, or they might have a necklace that also has this ability. Now your on hits do that without the weapon being related. It's a stat, it's getting queried from somewhere, and it doesn't really care which part is querying for that specific thing. If you want to get into the finer details of this sword spawns 3 interdimensional tentacles, then you might make an array and put things in the array when the player equips it, but it's still the same kind of effect. You just query and put it in the array when the player equips that item. And to add even on top of that, Diablo 3 is a game that had plenty of seasons, and seasons tend to be major game-changing events that like introduce new laws into the game. One of the things that they did there is that they have like the Horadrim Cube, where you can literally take legendary items, extract out their effects, and then equip them on the character without having the original item at all. Literally because it's all stats. Under the hood, you can even, when you share it in the chat, you can literally see how the item is serialized because it's going into your clipboard.
And that's the thing too, is like people really should focus on that portion of it, is that it's all about like you're making the rules, you're generating the data, so you decide what information you would need to get it back again. Conceptually, like you could have the most complicated things in the world in your system, but if you can assign a number between 1 and 10 to it and save it out, and you get back the number 10, you can reconstitute back as complicated a thing as you like. So it's worth remembering that what we're really talking about here is purely just that information boundary of what it is that you need to get that information back, and how small can it be, and you can store it in whatever way you like. And so the question of why is it so complicated, the answer is because there's not a way to do it. There are whatever ways best suits the task you're doing and the way you decide to do it. I don't want to go down the whole DSL rabbit hole as another one, but the point is that you define the language or the rules or the subsets that you're doing. If you define that the letter Z equals tree in your game, you can store out the sequence of trees as ZZZ for all you like, right? It's entirely up to you in whatever capacity makes sense for your game. And then without going even further, you want to get into compression. Why store it as ZZZZ when you can store it as Z5, which technically you could reconstitute back into a series of Zs, which could be constituted back into trees, which could then be resolved by your tree factory. So it's not like there is a set rule. It is purely informational. It's understanding how do I get this information out and then get the information back in again, you know?
Yeah.
Totally agree. Now, should we go on to the second question?
Yeah, let's go for it. Before somebody opens the rabbit hole.
I love how that was one question.
that was. I flipped back over to the list. I was like, okay, yeah, that was the first one. Let's go on to number 2. Before we do, I want to really quickly mention the multiplayer mastery course. We had our call for the dedicated server lesson this morning, and at 6, so in like 7 hours, we'll have our second call for the day, going over the lesson where we get into character creation, character listing, and deletion. And then for our next lesson, we'll get into the dedicated servers, loading that up and building out an extraction game. And this one, I've done it. So the first half, it was very lecture style. It's a multiplayer racing game where it's literally just, here's the code, here's the examples, here's the lecture explaining how it all works. The second one, the second half of it with the dedicated server part, going the complete opposite route, so that everybody's kind of got another way to do it. And I think that I like this way more, and so far people do too, where we're building it from scratch, step by step. You get all of the code is available to download, but it's also just on the page and going through step by step the entire process of making the game. So you get a full-on extraction game, multiplayer, run in there, battle each other, steal each other's items, kill NPCs and all that. Also take control with the server. There's a large list of all the features and stuff. I don't want to go on about it too much, but I did want to at least mention it. So if you're interested in multiplayer stuff or just building big stuff, you can obviously do it single player. Come check that out. But where's that other question now? Here we go. Oh, speaking of, the thing that reminded me of it was that Zach, who's in the course, is actually building a VR racing game, and he was talking about it earlier this morning, and we're going to be looking at it later on this afternoon. So that's what made me think of it when I was reading this question. It says, I'm working on a VR racing game. What's a good way to dampen the violent rotations involved in a crash or collision to reduce motion sickness, but keep the vehicles nimble and reactive? I assume Story would have some long thoughts on this, and I assume Zach would too, but
we've had this conversation many a time. So going back to the usual, what causes motion sickness? Why do people get motion sick in VR, right? The number one question is going to be solved by that. And the answer is it's usually vestibular issues. So effectively, your ear, there's like a liquid, and your body uses this concept of a balancing to like detect when you're on solid ground. And if you have vestibular issues, that's your body's internal sense of balance is out of whack, and that's how you feel sick. You're like, I'm ocular, like seeing motion, not feeling motion, or vice versa. And that's the same with boats and motion sickness. There's a disconnect visually between a sight line versus how your body moves. And so, in short, most of that sickness comes from this disconnect. And that's why the number one thing you can do in VR to avoid motion sickness is avoid those kinds of weird discrepancies. So, for example, if you accelerate, which is great in most games, that causes more shifts in motion, which causes more sickness in VR. So the general advice in VR is don't have acceleration, have constant velocity where possible. That's one. Two, what's the usual advice when you're car sick and you have car sickness? People say either look out the window or do something else. Don't read a book or something. Why? Because if you have a reference frame that is different from the movement frame, your brain can go, I can see part of this frame is movement, part of it is not. I feel more comfortable. So in short, another part of making yourself more comfortable in VR is give yourself a reference frame. And so there's a lot of tech around that about using some form of people will put you in a literal frame, or they will like make it look like a window, or they will have some aspect of the hood of the car visible. So as long as your brain sees a portion not moving and a portion that is moving, you feel a lot less sick because your brain's like, okay, This bit's solid. That's just the outside that's moving. But if it thinks itself is moving, that's where you're getting into weird territory. So in short, if you want to avoid sickness in VR, give them a way to separate visually what's moving and what's not moving from themselves, and avoid that idea of some sort of velocity changes, and try to keep velocity as solid as possible. So
how do you do that with crashes, though?
Well, it depends on how bad you want to get, but the short answer would be is if as you crash, you did like a crash test dummy type thing where the camera zoomed out and you're looking at a frame and you saw the crash happen on a screen in front of you and then flipped back, you would feel like it happens in a movie and you'd get the feeling, but you would separate yourself from the concept of the crash happening. Like again, it's all psychological. It's down to it's same principles are true. It's like, how do you separate you from the concept of the crash, or like I said, anything that gives you that sense of like a reference frame in front of you.
It's just eject him, let him keep going, flying through the wall, right? No, I like that idea, the pullback. I think that seems interesting.
That's why there's also things like snap turning, right? Like, because if you turn slowly over time, that's an acceleration change. If you snap turn, you're not feeling motion happens, but you're not feeling a change of motion over time different from how your body feels it. So again, almost all of these solutions are the same thing. They're understanding the core principle of you want to separate the difference between what you're visibly seeing motion versus your effectively vestibular system feeling motion. That's if you think of it in those terms, it's always the same solutions.
I remember I did a lot of experimenting with VR when I got my first headsets and motion and movement and stuff. It's a fun topic. Most airsick I've ever been. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. Reading a comment at random. Anyway, I don't know. Were there other questions you guys wanted to dive into? I didn't see any others popped up. I haven't saved any off. Other than why is game architecture a pain? I don't know that that's one that you got. Oh, you got the answer to that one?
No. Actually, there's a topic we can get into that here. That's really recent. Unity uploaded a video on the UI toolkit updates happening.
Oh, okay.
As part of the Unite conference. It's just now live on YouTube. And one of the topics that they had there is that they kept saying that people talking about people working on Unity UI or UGUI tend to have problems with working together because everything is either prefab based or has a lot of layout concerns where the layout doesn't update as often as you'd like, so you can't see how your content would work or how it would animate without actually entering play mode, doing the entire process until you reach the point at which you can interact with the UI, specific UI that you're working with. And they are addressing that in the new UI toolkit that is getting closer to parity with UGUI. And they've made a bunch of adjustments to iterating on that, specifically through hierarchical changes. So if you have an interface trying to present for a player in UGUI or Unity UI, you would generally have like a canvas. The canvas would have a panel. The panel would be dedicated to the player. Then every piece of UI there has to be manually binded such that it will eventually lead to a player stat. So, for example, the health bar would have to get a player reference. The player reference would then provide the health. The health would change its fill. But you have to program all that manually. And every panel that you have to find manually and like bind to it. Now, you could program your own ways to deal with that, but one of the main problems that comes pretty early on when you try to do that is that sometimes you spawn elements at runtime. And if you only bind once and you don't keep a record that any new element checks and binds to, you don't have a way to figure out like, okay, what is this element supposed to be binded to? For example, if you have an inventory and you're
like binding to collections and stuff.
Yeah, you have to bind to something so you can keep asking it for updates. Yeah. And in UGUI, there's no code for that. In UGUI, you have to do literally everything yourself. Yeah. But in UI Toolkit, they added a new binding system that literally lets you say, this panel exists solely for this piece of content. And then by the data path listed for everything that you add, you can have everything for that panel check that piece of content and show the data. So if you have a player and you're saying this panel is for the player, and then you had a health bar and the player has a health bar path, that health bar is going to start updating like with the player, which is a great thing to save you a lot of code. And it's also like all based in, XML and the Unity style sheets. So it's all in plain text files, which means everybody can work on that together. And if somebody changes a piece of the style, it applies consistently to all the style elements. So UI Toolkit is getting better. There's less code involved in making all of that fancy stuff work now. They showed a bunch of like really interesting things, such as creating unique styles for different sections of a health bar, making sure the transitions take some amount of time so the colors change gradually, making a lot of data elements that you can like check before without even entering some sort of play mode. And on top of that, they showed that they're finally working on World Space UI for UI Toolkit. That one is a very contentious topic, specifically because they are saying it's using the full Unity render pipeline elements. So it's like it's fully fledged, and it's not like a hack that they're just throwing it somewhere else and just like presenting it. Supposedly, I don't know, because that part is not released yet. So I'm pretty happy with that. And hopefully, really hopefully, this will work with shaders. They said that they know that a lot of people are waiting for shaders. I really hope that they will.
Yeah, that would be nice. I feel like that those are the two kind of biggest things that it's missing in UI Toolkit. I also though and I don't know, bring story back in here.
Big story.
Yeah, I wonder how many people actually have that problem though. I mean, they talk a lot about the problem of multiple people working on the UI at once and having these overlapping problems. And I've been in some pretty big places, and it's still it was never really common that there were a lot of people doing UI stuff overlapping and having problems in any workflow that I've been in. Like it's never been like a big issue.
Specifically on that UI stuff, the one that's bigger problem in my opinion by a huge margin is the fact that having a text mesh pro, an image, and a text mesh pro breaks the fucking batch to the point where it's like it's much worse for performance. So this idea that it's obviously smarter to have modular components for a user model versus a line item inside of a descriptor grid is infinitely worse for performance than having an entire canvas dedicated to the text changes and stuff is infuriating to the point where if they're going to solve any problem, they should be aiming to solve the fact that it's like exponentially worse performance to the logically consistent way to do it than to do it the other way. So I don't know. To me, I think that's a losing battle. Like if you making it more modular is not like it's already a problem. I would. That's why I'm really hoping they put more resources into new UI stuff, because the fact that the best way to structure reusable modular components is directly at odds with performance calculations is infuriating. That they are actually diametrically opposed, and that to me is a much bigger fundamental issue with the UI system than anything else they could spend their time doing.
Understandable.
I would also really like to see the data binding just get backported in as a simple package for the existing UI stuff, because it's not difficult to build. I mean, you could put something together in a day that all the beginners could use to start doing some basic data binding of an object to a text file and an object to a progress bar and an object to an input. Or even to like an observable collection of stuff. I feel like if they put some of those in as some default components and stuff, it could solve most of the problems for the people that don't know where to start with that, at least. And for the people that already know how to do it, I don't feel like it's a big problem that they're solving. I think that UI Toolkit's great for like the editor stuff and the new features and functionality going forward, but the complexity versus the benefit, plus the fact that it still doesn't support the shaders and world space, kind of the biggest thing.
I mean, data binding is like 6 lines of code. Like conceptually, it's a contract. It's a single bi-directional. Like, sure, there's a couple of things to catch regarding, like, again, notification cycles and having cyclical loop. But fundamentally, you could data bind your stuff with a few lines of code. That to me is such a non-problem, you know.
Yeah. Just to clarify to literally everybody, if you want to make a player-bound health bar, or literally any bound health bar, literally just have a script that stores the current bound one, have at runtime, say, find that script, assign me as the thing that it's providing data, and then literally every element that spawns, crawl up the hierarchy, find the root, ask it, hey, what am I supposed to be bound to? Okay, I'm getting this piece of data now. Great, done. And then literally you just keep extending that as you need. And you're not going to end up having like an infinite amount of things that you render. A bar that fills up based on value, a number display, a string display, you're basically done. Maybe add a format.
And even those,
Or maybe a
like,
list.
Yeah, and like honestly, I wouldn't even be binding to fields. Like, yes, there's some popular models out there where people bind to fields through individual scriptable objects, which fine, but generally, like, I would just bind to the entity model. If I've got a player that has a health, a mana, or whatever, yes, I might accidentally be updating 1 or 2 things when I don't need to, but it's so much simpler to say player model has changed, dirty flag, do different stuff, like player data specifically, like just the whatever data represents on that display. So like you can get away with data model binding on, like, you know, divide your content up into layers of likelihood to change. Player stuff changes all the time, those specific fields, split it up into the stuff which doesn't change, the stuff which does, constantly refresh the stuff which does, dirty flag, refresh stuff when it changes. Like it's not really that big of a problem, I think.
Yeah, it isn't, but it's one of those friction things that you'll see a lot happen a lot for people that are just starting with Yugoi, which gets into the main topic that I wanted to say to answer Weimann's question. There is a lot that is going on in Yugoi that is just a simple result of the system being frictionful. Yugoi builds on a bunch of things in Unity that are never explained to you, and you're just expected to know them, even if you read a documentation that has not been updated in years. There's like literally nothing that tells you this is the behavior that should happen here right now. Just accept that it makes sense and work with it. And when people try to work together, because those things are not explained, they cause issues to themselves. They basically hit themselves in confusion. And I'm not saying that as a call of a skill issue. I'm saying the system is designed to make you fail at using it because you don't know the secret sauce that is only mentioned in like Unite 2017 and Unite 2018.
Well, you didn't go?
But the thing is, like, I'd say even simpler. Like, how do they have a scroll rect with no way of populating a scroll rect intuitively, with no concept of having, recaching the individual? Like, anyone in the entire bloody world in Unity who's using a scroll rect wants to fill it with stuff, and about 50% of those people
it's usually a list of
storing
buttons.
a list. Yeah, if you're storing a list of bloody things traditionally, and if you're going to be storing like a list of inventory items, you're going to want to have to pool and reuse the same entities for the visible display, and all of this is code you write yourself. Now, to me, again, we're going back to like bang for your buck and value. It's infinitely more valuable to me if they just had a inventory scroll rect, even if it was called inventory, which probably is too specific, just to say, this is a scroll rect, you define the prefab, we'll create X number of items, and we'll manage the loop of them as you scroll up and down without having to reach it. Even that is more valuable to me than anything else they would spend their time. Like, these to me are the fundamental layers of like, how does this stuff functionally work that isn't explained or worked with, you know?
Yeah. And on top of that, it's not only that there are a lot of things that like you don't know, ergo you're bound to fail. It's that there are a lot of stuff that people want to have, but the system was not designed with and has not been updated to take care of. So now that they have to hack around it. And they made the entire thing very modular, so you can hack around it without internal code, looking at you, literally everybody in the Red Hat Pipeline department. But it's still not a clean cut solution. Like you have to do a lot to recreate basic elements of the system just to do certain behaviors that are expected of high-end games. When I work on any piece of content for games that I'm designing on, like working with others, etc., I try to compare what I'm working with to the top 3% of like what I know in the field. And every game that respects itself does a lot of stuff for player experience that are just straight up not implemented in UGUI. And I can go and implement them, but it's taking lines of code and time that I would rather implement in working on the game. So it's a very frustrating experience. And on that front, just putting it very clearly, UI Toolkit isn't handling that well either, in my opinion.
Well, hopefully it gets updates and keeps getting love and gets better. But I would really love to see some more stuff for UGUI as well. I feel like it's been kind of abandoned. But Paul, this question popped up and it made me think of you because you've got some beautiful terrain flying around right behind your head. They said, how about an updated terrain rendering system? I'll make a 16 by 16 kilometer world and wait for the hardware to catch up. What are the limits on terrain now? And have there been some pretty big updates with the terrain system?
I thought you were about to say, Paul, what are your thoughts on the Unity's terrain system? It's pretty good, right?
Yeah, I know. We'll start with the more technical questions and get into the problems. But yeah, like what can you do?
Maybe I will start it from something different. When we released our middle pack, it was 2017. You could render in high quality 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers with about 60 to 90 frames per second in HDRP and standard. Yeah. Nowadays, big. I wouldn't say you should go higher than 512 by 512 with the same amount of quality. Yeah, that's why when we released our mountain pack, we couldn't do it 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. We had to go lower to 500 by 500. Yeah, because HDRP slowed down a lot. Yeah, the URP not as much, but HDRP slowed down. So yeah, even though they added lots and cool stuff, and it's getting better, it still is very, very slow. Yeah, it's few changes in 2023.1 helped, but 2023 broke everything again. So yeah, for me, they shouldn't change it. They shouldn't add anything. They should just rip off everything that's older than 2023 and write new on top of that. Yeah, because they still have so much backlog of wrongly managed data in terrain that even magical users like Jason and Boot can't handle when they rendering the terrains. Yeah. We can't do it. Jason Boot can do it. Procedural Words, from what I know, are working on their own terrain. They showcase some things, so their own terrain solutions. So yeah, it should be scrapped and it should be done bottoms up.
I will say personally, I measure the quality of Unity's internal work on that stuff as an inverse to Jason Booth's blood pressure. The more he's shouting on Twitter, the more I know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the worst thing is that they are the new terrain solutions was supposed to be GPU, yeah, but they still left the old CPU connection and all the CPU layer to it. So all the CPU layer, when you change anything in GPU, it is transferred back to CPU, and it takes time. So everything you change, everything you try to do it won't work. Yeah, so no, it has to be changed a lot.
I just want to point out we should totally do a stream sometimes on Unity's systems. And should this one be scrapped or should this one be updated?
Oh, that would be interesting next stream. Yeah, we are going system by system and checking.
Just straight up yoink this part out, keep this part in, yoink that part out. I think we'll end up with less than half the engine, but this is the way it must be.
Yeah, I feel like that sounds like a lot of fun.
You're very optimistic.
Yeah, no. I'm not optimistic. I said I think we'll end up with less.
Okay. Let's go through a couple more of these questions. Another one, Juan Pablo asked what you think of Unity gaming services. Anybody have it? I've been using it a lot lately in the coursework, but I'm curious what everybody else's thoughts are. If you guys have any experience with it.
I've used some. I'm not a fan. I'll keep it there.
Okay. Story?
I just like more services because at the end of the day, as long as you're going back to the concept of a contract, as long as I have a contract that says go do A/B testing, go do analytics, I could use whatever service is there. And hey, more options is more options. I don't really care too much. I like the fact that things are becoming more like singular pricing model. I mean, people, yeah, you can argue about pricing and subscription services, but I at least like the fact that you're not having to go and pay $12 for Teams and $8 for this and then $14. Like it's getting to the point where it's like if you're they want you in on their service pipelines, and once you're in on them, everything sort of works with each other. Whether it works as good as it should is a different question, but there is something nice to be said for having unified dashboards and interconnected data and being able to work with things in one go. I don't think it's there yet, but I at least I'll put it this way. I wish Unity hadn't gone the software as a service route as their main primary goal, which they seem to be doing. But the fact that they are at least means they're trying to do it, which means they are putting effort into it. And so, for what it's worth, it's at least interesting, and I'm curious to see where it goes.
It's fair. Yeah, I've been using it, like I said, a lot in the multiplayer mastery course. It's super easy to get into for authentication, remote saving, voice chat, running cloud on the code, and running servers. It's, I would say, tiny bit. It's even easier than using Steam, and Steam is pretty damn easy in my opinion because it's very heavily integrated into the engine. Like with the cloud code stuff, they put in a deployment setup. Now you just literally create a definition, it creates a solution for you, and you hit a button to deploy. Your code's up there running, and you can run stuff authenticated against a player or server or whatever. And they have all the different authentication setups integrated in it. So overall, I think it's good to use. I don't know, when you get to like an actual production level thing, it really comes down to costs and where your market is and what devices you're deploying on. But if you're just looking at like development, like Story said, you can push out, deploy to it, and use everything. And then you should be wrapping that on your client anyway, so that you can switch that out to whatever it is that you want at any time, whether it's Unity
I think it's a good bridging gap, right? Like a lot of people have made Unity games where they kind of just stop at the I made the game portion, and they're not going to do A/B testing. They're not going to be doing config files remotely they can modify. They're not, because it's not like these aren't really concerns they have. But if Unity turned these things into 2 or 3 clicks, I guess they'll add them as like a thing to play with. So like as much as I personally use Firebase in a lot of stuff, and it's cool, and it's pretty quick to set up, but it does require you to go and grab a Google authentication JSON file and configure that up correctly. And even when you do, it basically gives you a glorified database that you can store JSON packets into a table structure, but you're still doing it all yourself. You're still figuring out the rest of the layers and whatever. You can then go like loot locker style approaches, which have a bit more abstraction on top of that for like game dev concepts and things. But the fact is, each one of these, now you have to try to find a way of tying your loot locker backend stuff. And then some of it works with Seam stuff. Some of it's this, that, and the other. For all the benefit, like one way or another, whether or not it's the best solution, I don't think is a good question. I think it's more important to go, will people, if a game won't have these at all, if these things are all roughly bundled together and good enough, will it be an easier, for most people to add this sort of content to their game? And I think so. Like, I think you'll get a world where more people will have an easier time bridging these different systems together and using them if they're more 1 or 2 clicks and integrated and whatever. And it's in Unity's best interest to integrate with other systems. Like if Unity end up with solutions which let you arrange a bunch of achievements in your game that hook up to their servers to do something, and then you press a button and then that synchronizes and automatically configures all of the achievement system in Steam for you, all the better, right? And it's worth their while to do that. So I think I can see a world where the services get better, if only as a bridging technology between everything else, because it's native to the engine. Again, I don't know if it'll be good, but I think the question has to be asked less about the practicalities of what's optimal versus what actually gets used and done. And as I've been repeating all year, last year, and probably all this year, I want to see more projects done. And I think sometimes you have to figure out where that goes and where the boundaries are. And I think providing more services that just get things finished is probably a good thing, regardless.
On that note, getting projects done, the only thing that I would say I am a fan of in Unity's entire gaming services suite is literally just the cloud build section. And that's literally just because it saves me time from configuring my own repository to spin up an instance that gets all the content, that builds the thing, that uploads it to a certain place that only certain people can use, and gives me a link and lets me, like, it deals with all of that. But this is just, it saves me from me creating a fancy script that does that for my own game. And it guarantees that it like updates as long as I use that service. But that's the only one that I am like quite a fan of. The lobby stuff is quite okay. Matchmaker, I never work on games that actually need that kind of stuff. The relay is acceptable, except most platforms, at least the big ones, Steam, PlayStation Network, etc., are closed gardens in a way such that if you use them, you only use them for the most part. You can make whatever other versions you want. Like if you're using Steam, you're not blocked from using Relay, just to be clear. But when you create connections in the game, it's a lot of programmers will not program it so that they have multiple systems available at once. In Terraria's case, for example, we do allow it, so you can do by IP or by Steam. And we just switch the pipe that we use for that connection. And we have a friends system that Unity also has. I have not used it to determine whether it's good or not, but to have a friend system, you need to have a big enough audience and natural finding of players for that friend system to actually matter. So
that is one thing that I always liked about the Steam thing, is the fact that it's very easy if you're using Steam services to basically query their friend list and interact with stuff, and even do the like request access to a game and have that packet to like join people on games and stuff. Like that stuff is surprisingly easy to set up. Obviously, you have to like take in the data and like reconstitute them into the game at the right location on your side, but just to be able to have that integration with the friends list and be able to define they are in this world at this location with this ID for the server, like send that information back and forth is very nice. So that's always been quite fun.
Yeah.
Hello to Twitch. We got one person on Twitch. Nobody ever watches on Twitch. It's always on YouTube. I just wanted to pop that. Go ahead. Were you going to say more, Yuri?
No, I think I'm good.
So let's go on to the next one. Not entirely to reopen the database discussion, but what would be an ideal way to manage multiplayer cosmetics? In this case, it's just the same as any other multiplayer item. You just, the same way that you deal with your inventory or any other thing that you're persisting the characters, you're just going to be storing something in there. It may be a separate field of, or a separate set of data, but you're storing off those things that are showing the cosmetics. I mean, most of the time in a lot of games, it's typically related to the specific items that they're wearing, and then it's just cosmetics that either the item or specific optional alternate versions of the item, or like a selection of different visuals for the item. But anybody got extra thoughts on this?
The only real complicated thing I'd say on that is it's a fundamentally different question if you're downloading cosmetics the person has, which you may not have locally on your machine, versus simply which ID configurations they have for whatever it is they're doing. That's the only real like difference, I would say.
I would say it's not different at all. And let me expand on that. When you're talking about cosmetics, there's a lot of things beyond just items. For example, you can have a player height customizer. So now you have a float. That's not a representation of an item. But the point being, at the end of the day, you just have things that you want to send over. The other person needs to get those things. They need to unpack them, and they need to present the right thing. You saying, I am holding the legendary hero sword, and also my hair is purple, and also I am 2 meters tall, is all fine and great. This is just like text presentation you can do. You can literally create a tiny data thing that says player height, active weapon, player hair color, and you send those 3 over. Now, you don't need to have any other content loaded on the other player's end. You can even send it to a server that does not have a presenter nor any of the content, and that would be perfectly fine. Once it's on the other client, it's that client's responsibility to present what it actually got. So if you don't have the item that the other person said that they have, you literally just need to look at the database. If you don't have it locally on the database, download it and then present it, which is why it's not a different question for me. And on top of that, literally any of that data stuff that you send is just up to you. So it's like, it's not even a database question. It's like, you get stuff, how do you present them? Present them.
Well, I just meant like someone who's asking a database multiplayer question. That to me, that's different than, because for example, if you have both if it's all content that comes with the game at launch, then you can entirely solve it by just an array of IDs or equivalent. But if you have some other external content that may or may not be a DLC download or something that someone has, or maybe they upload a custom skin on one side and they have to get it from the other, you now have to contend with that has to be uploaded to a server, managed with something, and then loaded back down by the other person and structured in that capacity. So like to me, it's to be more accurate, what I meant was there's a difference between content which is kind of endemic to the system you're building versus content which can be remote or managed or downloaded separately as like a additional DLC type stuff.
I would say that's still not different, because in the end, all content that you send is just an identifier to what you should present. And if you don't have a resolve for that identifier, you try to resolve it by means that are external. And if those fail, you just decide what happens. So you could say, prevent the situation altogether because the identifier of he has more DLCs than you, ergo you can't play together, ergo don't present anything about each other to each other. That's one solution. The other solution is you do include all the definitions of items, even if you can't present them. And then you can see, oh, he's holding the item that's actually a DLC item, but you don't have that, and you're not going to see it. Or you can have literally all the items in, resolve it as you wish, no problem there. But it's like a solution. And also, you can literally just make items invisible if you can't resolve them, and you can also crash the game. Things happen.
Yeah.
Bad reviews.
I remember in I think literally every MMO I've worked on, that's kind of how the inventory and item linking type stuff would work. You would send over, they say you want to link an item in chat. You send over, it's basically an ID. It's a hashed ID, and then it does a server request to go get that information if you actually click on it. And then you get the little pop-up of the stuff if you don't already have it cached locally. So it checks to see if you got it locally, and then does that pop-up so you're not spamming out a bunch of data. Before we move off of multiplayer stuff, I wanted to just last time mention the multiplayer mastery course. We got our call coming up in like 6 hours. This is the last time I mentioned it because I got to end the show in just a little bit. But in about 6 hours, we got our next call going into dedicated server development for games, and we've already done the peer-to-peer stuff. It's a lot of fun. If you want to come join us, check that out. And there were like 4 more questions I wanted to see if we could jump into. Story, I just wanted to pop this one up for you. The Bull said they're a Doubleton guy. Make sure everything's doubled so you never know what version. I know how much you love singletons, and this popped up earlier, and I just had to say it. I was like, oh yeah. And then chat overlay. There we go. And then Yorai, did you play with Unity's Kinematica?
I avoided it like the plague. Just to very briefly answer on that, if we are talking about Kinematica as in the solution that is the dots animation system that got discontinued right after they announced dots, yeah, I avoided it like the plague.
Okay, fair enough. And does anybody know the answer to Dave's question here on making a game button? What was that?
The answer is always pink.
Pink. You said it was magenta. It isn't red or magenta.
Yeah, I said it was magenta.
Oh, okay. I missed that.
From what I'm
my
seeing,
daughter would
black,
agree.
but alpha set to 0.
And then Jonathan asked, looking to develop a multiplayer game in dots, would your course be applicable even if it's game object focused? If you don't have multiplayer experience, it would definitely be. If you already know how to build a multiplayer game with game objects and you kind of understand the fundamentals of networking, then dots is going to be a slightly different setup and it's probably not going to be as useful. But if you don't already know how to build multiplayer games and all of the core fundamentals of networking and all that stuff, then yeah, it would probably be useful. If not, and you sign up, just send me a message and let me know. Let me see. There was another question, but I lost it. Anybody have what the other question was? Where did it go? Or anybody have another one that they saw and I missed that you'd like to take real quick before we go?
There was a question between terrains and meshes also.
Oh, okay. Where was that?
One thing is not really a full question, but just something you touched on, Jason. You were saying, you mentioned earlier that you would hash IDs. Just another little fun thing to describe. It's a small thing, but it gets into more of these like layers of fun stuff. If you have a character defined as like 5 or 6 different outfits or 5 different like components of an outfit, you could store each one and then like reconstitute them back by querying for each one. But if you combine all the IDs and make a hash out of it, and then each of the configurations can be cached in their own way, you can look up a single hash combination with a lookup and do things a lot faster. There's a lot of cool things you can do with that as well, which gets back into performance and, you know, paying the memory cost versus the local cost. So hashing is actually a really fun topic to think about because it allows you to do even more interesting, efficient lookup stuff separate from the other topics or like intercombined with the other things we described.
So let's take this question that Paul called out. Because I don't need that much detail since it's a barren desert planet and semi-realistic. But how about the age-old question of terrain versus meshes and splat maps on meshes? You want to, before you give the answer, just kind of explain what this means for anybody who has never done it. Maybe they're 2D game devs and they don't know what a terrain is, or what that difference is.
And the difference is mostly about technology use, because the terrain system that Unity uses generates you terrain, instantiates you all the trees, grass that you paint on it, and then it renders it. The way how it does it changes depending on the Unity version. So if you're using Unity version 2021, 2022, or 2023, it depends what's in the backend because it changes quite a lot. It changes how it renders it changes which types of instancing it uses. If instancing is working on trees, it's only working on grass, if it's using normals, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of changes between it. The question between when you're using meshes, you have to do it mostly yourself or use some asset store that you can use. And I would say low-level graphics and mobile, you can use meshes, but you have to know how to batch everything. For higher quality games on PCs, you have to make your own system for splat mapping, for instantiating meshes, especially foliage and even on desert rocks and small items, because you want to have lots of them if you want to use them. So you would have to write your own mesh instancing or mesh rendering system or use one of the assets on asset store. So I would also suggest using base terrain for designing, as it's quite good for using as design tool and something like that, and then moving into some assets from asset store that instantiate all the trees or the grass and some similar things, and render them 10 times or many times faster than Unity built-in.
I was actually thinking that could make an interesting topic too, because the last time we were talking, Jason, we discussed the grid thing and the raycasting, and I mentioned that probably one of the only things that would have changed from the CodeMonkey version is that he was using the collider base as the like raycast detector, and I was saying you can just use a plane definition and raycast against the plane. You don't need colliders at all for that. And I thought a way to go kind of through that layers would be you could make a simple like 20 by 20 grid and instantiate game objects, then make another version which just uses the render calls directly, then use a version which batches them individually, then uses ones which do batch draws with the matrix array, and then like demonstrate the incremental layers as it goes up, as like the more control you take over the process, the fact you can draw exponentially more at much cheaper. Because I think that would be a quick way. It wouldn't touch on the sheer complexity of all of the triangle stuff that you're doing, but it would like teach people the fundamentals of like the difference between a game object versus array of matrices and the like single mesh render drawn or whatever,
Yeah.
You reminded me something that. Yes, I'll go ahead.
So last thing I want to just add. So meshes with instancing will be better, but you have to know how to do them correctly. And that's lots of coding to do it correctly.
On that note, when you want to post-process scenes, one of the things that I see that happens quite a lot is that people will make stuff that is human-friendly, as in we are making it quick, we don't care about the quality. And then at the end, they're going and polishing it all off for release version. Then it becomes far harder to edit going down the line, which is basically a hellish situation to be in, because you're basically locking yourself out of having fast iteration just for the sake of having the performance that you need. And that's literally not something that anybody should have to like deal and go through with. So I was looking at solutions for that back at the time, and one of the things is that you can have like a non-destructive solution that can rasterize into a proper solution, but that those systems tend to be very limited and like not available in Unity, because Unity didn't invest in that quite a bit. The closest thing I do have for that is that in Pro Builder, when you're creating simple meshes, you can actually, and it's a recommended thing to do, by the way, you can actually bake meshes in Pro Builder out into FBX and then import them and use the imported mesh as the final result. But that's just a very small thing that you shouldn't do. Yeah. I see that face, Paul. Now, the thing on top of that is far more important and easier to a degree. Did you know that you can post-process scenes before you enter the play mode? Yeah. So there is a class, and I'm going to send it to you, Jason, so we can look at that. If you don't mind.
Yeah.
That I talked to a friend not long ago, the developer of GenoKids, a very nice small action game. Heavily recommended people would look at that. But this class lets you access a method called onProcessScene. And this is basically going to run before every build of every scene that you have, and more importantly, before every enter play mode. And you can change the contents of the scene, and those contents would be serialized, which means you can literally change the end result of how the scene looks programmatically while keeping all the convenient ways of working within the scene. Just something
nice.
Just something that I thought is like worth mentioning in that context when you're choosing what type of workflow you want. The thing here, though, is those automated processes, when you are post-processing an entire scene and you're doing major replacements, they take a bit of time. So it's something that you need to do with care. I would recommend that you have like an off switch on your post-processor, and then just when you really need it, enable it, see how the end result looks, cooked scene, as it were, and then continue from there.
I remember I worked with a VR game where it was they would place all of the different prefabs and stuff individually, and they were placed into effectively subfoldered things relative to groups and categories, and then they would basically bake that out and do all of the generate the meshes into a second scene, and then they would build all of the scenes as a second build off of like underscore built on each of the ones. So they were doing that, but very manually. Basically, there was editor tooling and stuff, but effectively there was the scenes you used to modify stuff, and then the scenes that got spit out that became part of the actual build, like as two separate sets of scenes inside the same project. This was like, oh god, 6 years ago or something. But yeah, in the earlier days of VR, it was one of the common solutions to that kind of problem.
Yeah, many open world games, for example, if that use our word steamer, the word steamer takes your big scene, splits it into smaller scenes, and then you can work in the smaller scenes area and just update it to them. Yeah, so yeah, it helps a lot to process your project if you're starting to work on something bigger.
And it's not just like splitting the scenes into smaller scenes. You can also like bake unique situations, like separate these contents out so that they're not included in the build because this stuff is like experimental and not meant for usage. You can literally use it at any stage in your development to do whatever you need. And it's also like it's genuinely nice to know that once you write it, it's not going to be a forgotten human process. Like it's not a point of failure anymore for a human to fail at when they're building a game, which is a very unfortunate thing to happen if it does happen, especially on a big launch day.
Yeah.
Which is on a side note, why as much as it's a cool feature, I have never ever in my life recommended or even told people about, where possible, the editor only layer flag, because the amount of times I've showed someone about that and they're like, that's really cool. And I'm like, it is really cool. And then they frequently break their own project by parenting things underneath objects with that flag, and then they remove
Forgetting that it exists after
and
they
they
did
don't
it.
know why the project broke. And it's so I've like I once or twice told people about that, and now the only time I ever use it is when I use it on custom objects where I actively hide the display flag for my own hidden objects in the thing so they don't know they're there, and they'll like wipe themselves when needed. But like, yeah, I've seen many projects fail at that one particular utility.
Yeah. I've seen similar things with tags and layers. It scares me. Anyway, I've got to get running, but I wanted to thank everybody for coming out and everybody for joining us live. Don't forget to thumbs up, drop a comment, let us know what you'd like us to talk about next week. I have not done a recap video, and there was a great question I think would be fun to talk about next week on if there are any good use cases for Unity and Enterprise. The answer is no. I'm just kidding. I think it'd be a fun discussion, especially if we can get Dave to pop in as well.
My only short one or two on that is just to say that, well, the answer is obviously you can use anything for anything. One caveat is I'm very careful with using Unity for mobile applications, because it absolutely boils the phone and tanks battery and performance, and that's just a running problem. Unfortunately, there's no way to have like a headless lightweight Unity without all the cost of that, and like they don't have a background process runner in the way that you'd want for like an Android application. So just broadly, don't use it for like a regularly open Android application where possible. But
but that's, I'd say, a rare use case. Usually it'd be done for like a very visual interactive thing on mobile, if anything. The last couple things, don't forget to check out Nature Manufacturer stuff. That's all still 50% off for the New Year's sale. Not all, but a bunch of it is. You can go check it in the link. And also there's a free asset I sent out and did a little video about that yesterday. Make sure to check that out. Sign up for Jason Story's Discord server. Lots of good discussions there. Obviously, grab Terraria if you don't already have it, but I assume everybody here already has it, so it's not like, I'm going to say probably 70+% of people here have that game already on Steam. I would be shocked if they didn't. And then finally, if you're interested in multiplayer stuff, make sure you come join us for the multiplayer mastery course. You can see the list of all the stuff here, some of the lessons. This one's actually knocked out today, and we'll be going on to dedicated server logon and all that stuff early next week. So lots of fun. Anyway, thanks again, everybody, for coming out here and joining us. Thank you, 3 and Greg and Andrew. I almost forgot Andrew. And I guess we'll see everybody very soon. Anybody got any final words?
Have a fantastic year.
Happy New Year.